The happy life of a fun seeker in Marvel. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 301 3-Day Trip to the Magic City 7. Sherlock's exclamation captured everyone's attention, especially Hu Yifei. Looking at the young foreigner before her, Hu Yifei ran through all the faces she'd encountered since childhood and couldn't find a single resemblance. Frowned deeply. After all, according to his profile, Sherlock had never set foot on rabbit soil, but upon actually meeting him, he seemed incredibly familiar with everything about the area. Especially since Sherlock actually addressed the old professor's apprentice by name, and he seemed incredibly familiar with her. "Do you know him?" A finally couldn't help but ask. Sherlock could only smile awkwardly at A's question. He couldn't say he knew Hu Yifei from TV in a past life. Fortunately, Sherlock's brain was quick, and he immediately made up for it. "Oh, nothing much. I've only read a few of Dr. Hu Yifei's papers before, and seeing him in person is like seeing someone straight out of a movie." While A was still a bit skeptical of Sherlock's words, Hu Yifei, on the other hand, gave Sherlock a kindred spirit look before turning back to chat with Tony. After all, Tony, as Iron Man, the technical director of Stark Enterprises, and the creator of the Iron Man armor, was a true star in the scientific community. Even in some elementary schools in the US, Tony's profile picture was listed alongside figures like Newton and Einstein. But while A, Hu Yifei, and the old professor had let Sherlock off, that didn't mean Tony would. Ever since Sherlock's lame excuse, Tony's gaze had been constantly on Sherlock. As uncle and nephew who often hung out together, Sherlock was well aware of the signals Tony's eyes conveyed. "You're just a magician. If I could read a PhD thesis in engineering, I'd heat up this whole office." Sherlock naturally rolled his eyes at Tony's undisguised disdain. "You're in charge of a lot of things. Sometime, you should think about how you're supposed to teach. Have you prepared the courseware? Have you written the lesson plans? Have you graded the assignments?" After a brief exchange of glances with Tony, Sherlock proactively cut off his communication and sat down expressionlessly. Though outwardly calm, he was actually swirling with turmoil. Damn, who could have guessed what bizarre world he'd transmigrated into? My goodness, Eagle Sauce's places all Marvel action? Every day, it's just bullets flying, American IAI, classic acrobatics, skills on display, and the occasional alien presence. And Rabbit's Place is a harmonious and joyful comedy? Chasing both research and love, a simple yet blissful life? Sherlock silently shed tears of envy. It was obvious that not only was reincarnation a skill, but even time travel was. Damn, what a miserable life he'd been living through. Especially when he saw Tony and Hu Yifei's clasped hands, Sherlock broke out in a cold sweat for Tony. He'd never have guessed that this seemingly fragile woman shaking hands with him possessed a unique martial art called Ganya Shan. It was so powerful it could instantly slam Tony into a wall and prevent him from being released. This was a sign that Tony's anxiety had improved significantly. If he'd known Hu Yifei had such a skill back then, Tony would probably be shaking hands with her in his Hulkbuster armor. How can I put it into words? Just thinking about that scene was fascinating. Despite his wild thoughts, Sherlock felt a small sense of relief and anticipation. After all, now that Hu Yifei was here, it meant there was a character worth mentioning. Huge Dolly. What boy couldn't love this huge dolly he'd seen back in AWU? Sherlock had the privilege of witnessing his former screen goddess in person. Indeed, Sherlock's guess was spot on. That afternoon, he saw the legendary's huge dolly, and just as he'd seen her on the TV series, she was truly bold and meticulous. A superstar academic whose brain could potentially surpass a computer's. During Tony's class that afternoon, Sherlock watched as this woman questioned Tony, their discussion spiraling into absurdity. Even towards the end of the class, Sherlock could clearly see that, aside from the old professor drinking with Tony, who had a look of "I understand. I've got the mantle," on his face, everyone else, including Hu Yifei, had a look of "what the hell are these two talking about?" Of course, after the class, Tony was deeply intrigued by this talented female student who could keep up with his thinking. He immediately extended an invitation to Huge Dolly to join the Stark group, promising her personal instruction as his successor. Tony's offer was truly generous, implying that this woman was worthy of inheriting his title of Iron Man. It's no exaggeration to say he wouldn't even refuse her offer to inherit the Stark group. Unfortunately, after some thought, Zhuge declined, stating that she needed to build her own country, but she was still willing to engage in scientific research exchanges with Tony. The two exchanged contact information, bringing their unexpected trip to Shuangding University to a close. Sherlock, and Tony then took a taxi and left Shuangding University. Now that they were here, why not take a look inside that legendary apartment and reminisce about their childhoods? Stop kidding, that's someone else's life. Sherlock said that after he'd traveled through time and picked up the AK-107 from his own shop, such a life was doomed to be his. Sherlock could only sigh helplessly and silently wish Zhuge and Zhang Wei a happy marriage. Damn it. Damn Zhang Wei. The hatred for stealing someone's wife is irreconcilable. Of course, Sherlock was just thinking about it. After all, posting a barrage of comments back then was one thing, but actually posting them right in front of the person himself would have been incredibly embarrassing. Chapter 302, 3 Days in the Magic City 8. By the time Sherlock and the other two returned to the hotel, the group of lesbians who had gone shopping had also returned. Usually, after a group shopping trip, there's a grand gathering to divide the spoils. Sherlock naturally didn't want to miss out on such excitement. Furthermore, since they had flown in by private jet, there wasn't the issue of too much luggage. Any unused items could simply be packed up and sent to the plane. The plane was still parked at Pudong Airport. When Sherlock actually entered the gathering, he once again clearly sensed the diverse personalities of the women present. Let's start with Pepper. As the CEO of Stark Group and Sherlock's future aunt, she's one of the few individuals who would be at the top of the heap of wealth anywhere in the world. Therefore, Pepper wasn't particularly interested in luxury goods. No, it's not that she wasn't interested in luxury, more accurately, she wasn't interested in luxury as defined by the Western definition. On the contrary, Pepper was incredibly fond of the high-end luxury goods of the rabbits. As everyone knows, rabbit luxury goods are nothing like those from brands like Donkey or Hermes. Branded goods, at best, are just a brand name. Most of the money you spend is actually the brand premium, while the actual cost might only be 1%. But the luxury goods from Rabbit are different. They're all about what you have, and you can't even imitate them. After all, even ordinary people can afford something like Hermes if they grit their teeth. At the very least, they can buy small items like a belt or a wallet. But the luxury goods from Rabbit are truly, if you weren't born into it, it's very hard for you to ever afford them again. So when Sherlock saw little Pepper pull out all sorts of single-sided and double-sided Suzhou embroidery, as well as Shu brocade and Yun brocade, he was completely stunned. Especially the double-sided embroidery, Sherlock racked his brains to figure out how they managed to show a cute kitten on one side and a puppy on the other. Not to mention the exquisite ink pads and ink blocks, each one was something Sherlock had only seen in CCTV documentaries. Especially when Sherlock learned that Pepper had also pre-ordered a number of gold bricks similar to those in the Forbidden City, his eyes widened. He hugged his future aunt's thigh and cried, demanding he wanted some too. In the end, Pepper could only caress Sherlock's head lovingly while calling the manufacturer to place an additional order. Sherlock aside, the others didn't understand, but A, B, C, and D knew all about this stuff. A and B, in particular, were so impressed by what Pepper had bought that their lips twitched. Honestly, if it weren't for their status, even A and B would have wanted to hug Pepper's thigh and call her godfather. Compared to Pepper's seemingly modest but in reality incredibly luxurious items, Black Widow's purchases were much easier to understand: clothes. All sorts of clothes, cosmetics, and more. After all, as the world's factory, Rabbit could buy just about anything you wanted, whether it was the latest season or the next. It was truly incredible. Rabbit not only sold the latest season's newest pieces, but, if you had the money, even the next season's new releases. It wasn't uncommon. You have to remember that before Sherlock traveled through time, it was just the next season's new products. It wasn't a problem for a rabbit. Compared to the two more mature women, Antonia's purchases were truly Sherlock's favorite. Like Sherlock, she had a bit of a playful streak, and her purchases were filled with all sorts of bizarre gadgets. From carrot knives to retractable swords for old ladies' fitness routines, she bought everything she hadn't seen before. Sherlock even found a yo-yo, a four-wheel drive car, and a complete four-wheel drive track among her purchases. Sherlock didn't hesitate, demonstrating a yo-yo trick for Antonia, causing her to bow down and request Sherlock to teach her his unparalleled martial arts. Meanwhile, A, B, C, and D watched Sherlock and Anthony's antics with twitching lips, marveling at the fact that their influence had spread beyond the borders. Ding, the youngest of the four, was especially so. If it weren't for her status and the circumstances, she'd have yelled at Sherlock, "Little Blackie." As for the two little girls, Lola and Mindy, well, they were still at the age of satisfying their appetites. Toys and clothes weren't particularly appealing to them, but snacks of all kinds were a real treat. That guy came back with a whole sack of snacks: tang monk meat, Weelong spicy strips, figs, a scallion, and so on. As the old rabbit, Sherlock naturally embraced all the treats. While he and Antonia played with the odd toys she'd brought back, he'd occasionally sneak a bite of the girls' treats. Of course, since the women were out shopping, it was inevitable that they'd bring gifts for the men. Sherlock didn't know about the others, but Black Widow gifted Sherlock an Hermes wallet. Pepper Potts gave Sherlock a set of gold bricks and then a complete set of Suzhou embroidery. Sherlock was so impressed that he decided to store all the embroidery and other items Pepper Potts had given him in his library for permanent collection. The other two girls were much simpler. They simply ignored Sherlock's snacks and considered them gifts for him. The only thing to say was Antonia. Even A, B, C, and D couldn't help but twitch their lips at the sight of Antonia's gifts. Antonia gave Sherlock a power bank shaped like a bomb. Yes, it looked like a bomb in the movies, with cylinders tucked together and a screen with a few lines on it, but this thing was a power bank. And it wasn't just Sherlock, Antonia also remembered the others. She gave Tony a power bank with a meow hammer and Sherlock's 5 uncles power banks shaped like magazines. It can only be said that Antonia, the internet-addicted girl, has suffered from severe battery anxiety since Sherlock and Tony built her prosthetic limbs and she began to transform into a cyberpunk girl. Sherlock said that this is a disease and must be cured. Chapter 303, Lost on the Green Train 1. Because everyone had reserved tickets for the green train departing at 6:30 p.m. on the third day, no one had any motivation to go out during the day. Sherlock's 5 uncles mysteriously dragged A, B, and Tony out. Sherlock didn't want to know what those old men were doing. He just wanted to lie quietly in bed, pack his bags, and prepare for the train trip he'd been craving that evening. Sherlock wasn't the only one preparing. The China Railway Corporation was equally busy. Logically, the China Railway Corporation had transported countless people like China Railway Corporation, from international dignitaries to exceptionally talented Olympic athletes. Tony's business was, at most, just a reception for wealthy foreign businessmen. There was no need to be so nervous. It should be something of some diplomatic significance, but not too significant. But, as with everything, there's a but. China Railway Corporation's entire experience is with high-speed rail. This green train was a first for China Railway Corporation. And what's more, the sleeper berths inside it. God knows how devastated Taizong was. He couldn't fathom why a super-rich man with a steel armor and a private jet would ride his train, and in a damn green suit at that. It was one thing to wonder, but the other people in this group weren't so easy to please. Look at that guy named Simon Riley. His passport photo showed him wearing a skull mask. Taizong really wanted to go across the Pacific and crack the heads of the American officials who issued the passports to see if they were truly wicked enough to have such a photo on a passport. But since the higher-ups had approved Sherlock's travel request, they'd naturally informed Taizong and even provided him with basic information on the others to avoid unnecessary trouble. Looking at the information in his hands, Taizong's hands shook, and even made sharp crackling sounds. These guys were all 100-man killers. They were like true killers. Taizong was truly terrified of what would happen if the security check picked up something they shouldn't have. In the end, the higher-ups gave the railway general manager a reassurance, telling him to proceed with whatever was necessary. Even so, a lingering fear remained, and the closer they got to the departure point, the more nervous they grew. Sherlock was unaware of the situation at the railway general manager's office. Around 4 o'clock, Sherlock ran to the supermarket to buy some supplies for the journey, and then everyone packed up and headed for the train station. Out of caution, the railway general manager had assigned someone to act as a lookout. Upon seeing Sherlock and his group disembark, they immediately communicated via intercom to everyone inside. Attention, attention. VIPs have arrived at the station entrance. Repeat, VIPs have arrived at the station entrance. All departments, attention, all departments, Attention, this is not a drill, this is not a drill. While the railway general manager was extremely nervous, Sherlock and his group acted completely calm. After all, before setting off, Sherlock had briefed everyone on the situation in the rabbit region. Besides clothing and food, the luggage of those present contained absolutely nothing illegal. All the illegal items were in Sherlock's library: Tony's suit of armor, Sherlock's uncle's guns, Black Widow's gear, and so on. It wasn't that the people present didn't trust Rabbit's safety, but they were already accustomed to caution. If they didn't bring anything, they wouldn't feel safe. Therefore, the entire entry process went remarkably smoothly, without the anomalies that Taizong had worried about. The only exception was Antonia. After all, her arm was a prosthetic, and it couldn't be removed. In desperation, Antonia showed everyone the seams of her prosthetic to show that it couldn't be removed. With the coordinated efforts of A, B, C, and D, Antonia finally passed through security. What? Those functions in Antonia's arm? Oh, no kidding, that's the most perfect fusion of magic and technology. If Antonia, Sherlock, and Tony didn't say anything, none of the muggles present would be able to tell. Of course, they weren't foolish enough to actually show off something like a mantis blade, but Antonia's prosthetic arm was indeed impossible to remove, so she passed safely. It seems Antonia might be the only person in the history of China Railway Corporation to have brought contraband aboard a train. Putting aside the minor security incident, everyone was incredibly excited upon entering the station, even Tony. Shanghai Station, though an old one built in the 1990s, has been completely transformed by the infrastructure enthusiasts of the Rabbits. Everything inside maintains Rabbit's usual high standards. It's no exaggeration to say that this nearly 30-year-old station is even more advanced than some American airports. No wonder these people were constantly exclaiming, as if they'd never seen anything new. After all, if you've experienced the American train system, you'd be amazed too. Damn, can you imagine that the tracks, so crucial to the train's operation, have 18 bends, and yet they're still running? Sherlock could even say, without exaggeration, that the Rabbit's green trains are a complete knockout compared to the American trains in terms of comfort. After all, the only train that could make Sherlock feel carsick and upset would be the train from the Third Brothers family and the train from the Eagle Sauce's family. One can only say that the Eagle Sauce family has a reason for having a developed car culture, and it's all forced out. Sherlock and his group were like ordinary people taking a train for the first time, queuing up to check their tickets, and then queuing up to walk towards the train compartment. Fortunately, Sherlock and his group were all in the same compartment, which had a total of 6 rooms. Sherlock, Black Widow, D, and Mindy shared a room, Pepper, Lorna, C, and Antonia shared a room, Tony, Price, B, and Ghost shared a room, Soap, Zia Okiang, Guz, and A shared a room. There were 6 rooms on the train, and Sherlock and his group occupied 4 of them. What made Sherlock feel most depressed was that among the 4 rooms, he was the only one who shared a room with 3 women. Seeing Black Widow's meaningful look, Sherlock finally gave in and ran to Tony's room to change into pajamas. After all, the train would take a full day, 20 hours, and 32 minutes to reach the terminal. Sherlock didn't want to spend more than a day and a half in outerwear. Since there were no outsiders around, he might as well change into comfortable pajamas. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 304, Lost on Journey 2. After Sherlock finished changing, he passed by the rooms of Soap, Zia Okiang, and the others, and his eyes nearly popped out of his head. On the floor of the 4 people's room sat an open suitcase, completely crammed with alcohol. Beer, white wine, casks, red wine, everything was there. Inside, the small table was already covered in a variety of snacks, and the 4 of them had already begun drinking. Seeing this scene, Sherlock felt a little uneasy. Wow, where did you all go so mysteriously today? So you went to buy alcohol, but then again, we haven't even started driving yet, and you're already drinking. Are you sure this is enough for a nearly 2-day trip? Sherlock grumbled inwardly, then calmly glanced at the large suitcase in the middle. Definitely enough. It had to be said that everyone in this car was a real tough nut, even that guy, B. Didn't you see that guy, Cheyenne Soap, Zhao Oqiang, and Guz, already flushed with alcohol, bragging about their past missions, and listening in stunned silence? Well, Sherlock silently crossed himself to that guy, praying his liver would be fine after this trip. After all, both Guz and Zhao Oqiang were heavy drinkers. Seeing the state of Soap's room, Sherlock grew curious about what was going on in the other rooms. He turned and quietly returned to Tony and Price's room, beginning to eavesdrop quietly. Soon, Sherlock left Tony and Price's room with a scowl. Damn, these old men were actually in class. Can you believe it? It wasn't really a class, it was just a game of war chess using Tony's 3D projection, with even Guy A joining in. Price and Ghost had flown through countless missions, so they were naturally adept at such real-time military simulations, even adding in a lot of necessary conditions. Tony, considering himself incredibly intelligent, was naturally incredibly confident in his military simulations. As for A, while he didn't know his specific situation, being able to enter the system and being nurtured by instructors naturally wasn't afraid of the three naive foreigners, so he was naturally eager to give it a try. With Tony's 3D projection, the four old men, like real generals, began to dominate Fang Kyung on the train. Sherlock also learned about the four men's bizarre victory reward: "You're awesome. Whoever loses has to say you're awesome to the other three." How should I put it? It's interesting, but not much. Turning back and continuing forward, Sherlock returned to his room. The three women inside were already busy playing Landlord, a card game, Edling's beckoning. It was obvious that their landlord game had no place for Sherlock, so he didn't interrupt. After all, they were going to spend nearly 2 days together, so he packed his suitcase with food and prepared to visit the people in the other two rooms. As he passed by Pepper and the other's room, even though the door wasn't open, Sherlock could tell from the crisp clattering sounds inside that they were playing mahjong. Sherlock was speechless. For a moment, he didn't even know how to react. Listening to the crisp clatter of mahjong tiles and the melodious clatter of little Pepper's gongs and hoots, he sighed silently. I just hope these women won't get lost in mahjong when they get home. Silently passing little Pepper's room, Sherlock took the pork cartilage snack he'd prepared and knocked on the doors of the other two rooms. As the doors swung open, Sherlock was stunned. Even calling out the name of the person who opened them. What the hell? Director Zhang Hu. Director who looked at the young foreigner holding a beautifully packaged pork cartilage snack and called out his online name with a look of surprise, a question mark filing his head. So his fame had spread beyond China? Director Hu stared at the enthusiastic Sherlock with a bewildered look on his face. He blankly accepted the gift from Sherlock, then, after a bewildered photo session with Sherlock, seemed to finally react. As a matter of fact, Director Fox struck up a conversation with Sherlock Sherlock. It was through this conversation that Sherlock learned Director Fox was introducing a railway line that traverses the entire country. It was precisely for this reason that Director Fox and his group had embarked on this particular train. Sherlock, compared to engineers like Tony or Zhuge, could understand Director Fox's insights, and he recounted his own experiences during his road trip. The conversation went smoothly, and after a while, Sherlock realized he had to visit his next fellow rider and quickly said goodbye. Of course, Sherlock didn't forget to tease Director Fox before leaving, wishing him luck in finding the water monkey. This embarrassed Director Fox, but he was certain that Sherlock was indeed a fan, and the water monkey meme was a well-known theme among his fans. After bidding farewell to Director Fox, Sherlock's mood was elated, like a fan meeting their idol. With a chuckle, he knocked on the door to the last room. As soon as the door opened, Sherlock froze, then visibly excited. The person who opened the door was a sweet girl Sherlock had only seen on TV in his previous life, Bing Bing. "Excuse me, what can I do for you?" Seeing Sherlock's excited face, Bing Bing assumed he was a fan or something, so, true to her professional qualities as a CCTV reporter, she politely inquired. Upon hearing Bing Bing's words, Sherlock immediately handed her the gift. "Oh, my heart belongs to Bing Bing, but, no, I'm a fellow writer. This is a small gift from me. Please accept it." In person, Sherlock played on some internet memes, making Bing Bing, though embarrassed, smile at Sherlock and accept the gift. Chapter 305, Lost on Journey 3. Sherlock was momentarily at a loss for words as Bing Bing accepted the gift. While in his previous life, Sherlock could boast and call her wife online, he was completely stumped when he saw her in person. Fortunately, Bing Bing was understanding. Furthermore, Since this was a public train space, she wasn't afraid of anything untoward happening. She approached Sherlock, saying, "Would you like to come in and sit down?" Bing Bing's invitation, coupled with her incredibly beautiful and sweet personality, moved Sherlock, and he accepted without hesitation. It wasn't until they entered the train compartment that Sherlock realized Bing Bing's room felt significantly more crowded than the others. The reason was simple: various waterproof boxes took up most of the space, and Bing Bing's compartment was occupied by one woman and two men. Upon seeing Sherlock enter, the three of them greeted him warmly and quickly engaged in conversation. Through their conversation, Sherlock learned that Bing Bing and the others were reporters sent by the central bank to promote the scenic Sichuan-Tibet highway, forming part of Director Who's support team. Sherlock was stunned by this. What he didn't know was that Bing Bing, Director Who, and others shouldn't have been here, but perhaps, to show some favor to Sherlock and his group, they had secretly colluded with the China Railway Corporation to arrange this trip. After all, compared to the mediocre people among the general public, national team players like Director Who and Bing Bing were undoubtedly much more reliable, ensuring maximum convenience for the four people. After all, Rabbit style has always been to play it safe, and people like Sherlock were the biggest source of instability for him. Sherlock had a vague sense of this, but he didn't point it out, choosing to continue his conversation with Bing Bing. Since Bing Bing had already explained their situation, Sherlock, in a gesture of courtesy, explained his own. Of course, Sherlock wasn't stupid. He wouldn't reveal the truth about what he and his 5 uncles were up to. After all, even a knowledgeable CCTV reporter like Bing Bing would be shocked if he did. People who could handle the cute-voiced boy were few and far between. Of course, aside from the things he couldn't share, Sherlock didn't hold back and revealed everything he could. It was obvious that Tony and Pepper were incredibly famous. Bing Bing's heart lit up when she heard their names. She was especially excited to learn they were in the same train car as her. As a reporter, who wouldn't want to interview such influential figures? Bing Bing was no exception. Sherlock had always had a soft spot for sweet girls, and he agreed to Bing Bing's request without hesitation. But Sherlock probably never imagined that this unintentional act would lead to a rather wild ride. After the train started moving, Sherlock quickly returned to Tony, who was happily playing with Price, and explained the situation. After all, they were just friends in the same car, so Tony didn't refuse. And so, thanks to Sherlock's encouragement, the entire car's passengers unexpectedly got to know each other, and a surprisingly harmonious atmosphere ensued. After everyone got to know each other well, Sherlock realized that his impressions of Director Fox and Bing Bing were all just filters. God knows why. Just a few hours later, Director Fox was drinking with Xiaoqiang and soap, while a sweet girl like Bing Bing was playing mahjong with Black Widow and Bing. Sherlock wasn't much better. He and Bing Bing's photographer also tried out the CCTV equipment. It must be said that the national equipment was truly impressive. From the operation to the accuracy of the shots, it was impeccable, worthy of being CCTV's exclusive magic mirror. Ever since the entire train carriage began to get acquainted, it became incredibly lively. The green train seemed to possess an innately sociable quality, allowing everyone to forge unique friendships within this small, intimate space. The noise and chatter continued until dusk, and Sherlock suddenly remembered something he'd always wanted to do. He quickly grabbed Bing Bing, his personal photographer, and Tony and Soap, who had joined in the fun, and headed for the hard seat section. Youth has no price tag, hard seats get you to the LS. This saying isn't just a meme, it's a real fact. Whether due to financial constraints or simply out of faith, this train is always filled with brave individuals who embrace this motto. Of course, most of these brave individuals are young. After all, sitting in a hard seat for 20 hours a day is truly unbearable for older people. For those of us who are older, such long hours in a hard seat are not just a belief, but pure torture. Sherlock admired these courageous individuals. Of course, because they predominantly consist of young people, the atmosphere in the hard seats is undoubtedly superior to that in soft or hard sleepers. Even though Sherlock's group's carriage was already bustling enough, the excitement, the brimming with excitement, filled with hormones, was a novelty once everyone stepped into the hard seat section. After all, aside from native locals like Bing Bing and the photographer, the rest of the group had come to the hard seat section to experience the atmosphere. They were naturally adept at parties, especially Tony, the showboating type, always the star of the show. Coupled with Tony's global fame, Sherlock's arrival naturally brought the atmosphere to a crescendo. Tony, the flamboyant contestant, even performed a song, drawing cheers from the young crowd. Even tough guys like Soap and Ziokian gave a clumsy dance routine, but despite their hilarious and awkward performances, there were no laughs, only friendly smiles. All of this was faithfully recorded by Bingbing's camera, and coupled with Bingbing's beautiful writing, it is almost certain that nothing can better illustrate the beauty and freedom of this trip. Chapter 306, Lost on Journey 4. The train arrived at Xining Station in the evening of the next day. This was the last stop before reaching the plateau, where everyone had to transfer to the dedicated aerobic train for the plateau. Sherlock was excited. Like most people present, he meticulously cleaned the windows of the new train with a towel he had brought with him. It was a tradition on the train to Tibet, after all. The simple-minded people of the plains always cleaned the windows very well, saving the cleaners a lot of effort. As Sherlock was enthusiastically wiping the windows, a young man sauntered up to him, looking a little embarrassed. Seeing that Sherlock had almost finished wiping the windows, the young man finally mustered up the courage to run over to Sherlock and try to communicate in broken English. Sherlock listened with a frown, unable to understand what the young man was saying. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he addressed a man whose English was so halting. "Can you speak Chinese?" Sherlock asked, and the young man across from him froze for a moment. It took a long time for him to react, as if a sudden realization dawned on him. "Oh my God, I forgot. You seem to know Chinese, huh? I'm just asking you about something." The handsome young man spoke with a genuine northeastern accent, which surprised Sherlock. His English, though halting, still had the air of a typical London native. Sherlock looked at the man speaking northeastern dialect with some surprise, and one thing became clear: there was absolutely no such thing as a domineering CEO in the Northeast. After all, judging by the young man's looks, he was definitely a domineering CEO. But for some reason, that conversation always gave Sherlock a silly vibe. The reason the young man had sought out Sherlock was simple: he was a true believer in the saying, "Youth has no price tag, hard seat to LS." He was one of the people who had been waiting for him. Ever since he'd seen Sherlock, Tony, and the national goddess Bingbing in the hard seat car that day, he'd been wanting to invite them for a photo in front of the Aura of Faith. After all, there was proof. If he hadn't said that his youth had no price tag, that he'd ridden hard to the LS, and even met Iron Man and Bingbing, he'd definitely be considered a fool. They might even retort, "Iron Man can be a green-skinned man?" Idiot, Sherlock agreed without hesitation. Even if he hadn't mentioned it, Sherlock would have wanted to take a photo with everyone after wiping the windows. After all, such an experience was rare among these people who were always ready to save the world. So, after Sherlock and the young man agreed took place, he immediately returned to his own car and shared this story with everyone. As expected, everyone responded to Sherlock's request, excitedly following him towards the meeting point. Even the usually stern Price managed to crack a smile. When Sherlock arrived, the young people holding banners reading "Youth has no price, hard seats direct to LS" couldn't believe their eyes. Who did they see? Not only Iron Man Tony Stark, but also the CEO of Stark Enterprises, the legendary most powerful woman on Earth, and Iron Man's lover, Pepper Potts. An curvaceous, red-haired beauty. Compared to Tony, this one was lesser known, having only been mentioned in a slew of declassified documents that recently appeared online. Natasha Romanoff, the former SHIELD agent and Black Widow. Add to that the curvaceous figures of Sherlock's 5 uncles, and even quite a few older-minded girls' eyes lit up at the sight of them. Compared to these people, Sherlock, along with Director Who and Bingbing, who stood beside him, looked quite ordinary. Well, it was Director Who was ordinary. After all, Sherlock was incredibly handsome, and Bingbing was sweet and adorable. Director Who was the only one left who was ordinary. Well, that's not to say Director Who didn't have his own unique qualities. He did, but they weren't obvious. Their arrival undoubtedly brought the young people's cheerful mood to a climax. They quickly formed into formation, placing Sherlock and his group at the center of the pack. Then, at Sherlock's direction, they all followed the local custom and shouted, "Eggplant." The pure white flags with their fiery red letters, combined with the Shanghai LS license plates that everyone had reserved, created a harmonious and beautiful picture. After a moment of frenzy, everyone, at the conductor's urging, boarded the new train. Their seats remained the same, and the bed numbers remained the same. The only change was that each seat and bed now had an oxygen port above their head. This was for those experiencing severe altitude sickness. If the sickness was truly severe, they could ask the train attendant for an oxygen tube, which could be connected directly to the bedside oxygen port for quick oxygen relief. Sherlock and his companions returned to their rooms with trepidation, their excitement lacking the initial excitement they had felt when the train started. Partly because it was nighttime and everyone needed rest, and partly because Xining was at an altitude of around 2,000 meters, no one knew if altitude sickness would occur during the upcoming journey, so rest was paramount. Therefore, everyone went to bed early. However, despite their thorough preparations, even halting all training before the trip to minimize the risk of altitude sickness, many in Sherlock's group still suffered from altitude sickness. Sherlock's 5 uncles were the worst affected. The next morning, they woke up to a scene where they had transformed from incredibly tough men into adorable little kittens, barely able to stand up. Compared to Sherlock's 5 uncles, Tony, whose body had been ravaged by alcohol and sex, was surprisingly unharmed. Pepper Potts was in the same boat, both of them looking as energetic as usual. Aside from these two, everyone else suffered some degree of altitude sickness, especially Black Widow, whose symptoms were almost identical to Sherlock's 5 uncles. Even Sherlock felt a headache and chest tightness early the next morning. Of course, that wasn't the most embarrassing aspect. The most embarrassing aspect of altitude sickness was the imbalance in air pressure between the body and the outside world, higher pressure inside the body and lower pressure outside. Naturally, humans have an instinctive response to help lower that pressure: farting. The sound of farts filled the entire train car almost non-stop. Farting isn't terrible, it's just a little embarrassing at best. But for some, altitude sickness also has a significant symptom: a stomachache. A stomachache combined with uncontrollable farting, well, anyone who's experienced it knows the effect. Chapter 307, Lost on the Green Train 5. With the onset of altitude sickness, the once bustling train compartment fell silent. Sherlock lay groaning in bed, constantly trying to glare at Tony, who had rushed over unbidden. Fortunately, every ounce of utter depravity has its day. Even if Tony had been perfectly fine, the drastic change in altitude would have set in as the train crossed the Tangula Pass. Unlike Sherlock and the others, their bodies had already adapted to the high-altitude conditions due to their initial symptoms. But Tony, unlike them, experienced every symptom and embarrassment Sherlock and the others encountered. Naturally, being such a jerk, Tony rushed to Sherlock to ask if he had any effective medicine the moment the symptoms appeared. Well, with 4 other people accompanying him, Tony wasn't foolish enough to just mention potions or something, instead opting for effective medicine. Unfortunately, Sherlock didn't have any specific medication for altitude sickness. After all, it was a tiny place like John Bull, so finding even a single feature was a struggle. Where could there be a potion specifically for the plateau? Even if there were, Sherlock, given his personality, would have been frantically showing off his potions the moment altitude sickness struck. Why would he even have to endure that awkward, splitting headache, completely refusing to believe a single word? It was simply that altitude sickness was tyrannical. The only people in the entire train car who were still in good shape and able to move around were the 4 people in Director Fox's compartment. Sherlock even went to ask these 4, seemingly impotent, masters how they managed it. The answer he got was simple and blunt: it's all about practice. Upon hearing this, Sherlock rolled his eyes at Director Fox and his group and declared he was no longer a fan, no questions asked. Fortunately, despite experiencing symptoms of altitude sickness, everyone had adapted quickly. By the time the train reached LS station, as long as they didn't engage in strenuous activity, they hadn't experienced any unbearable symptoms. Thus, a dramatic scene unfolded on the train platform at LS station. Sherlock and his companions, each pulling their own suitcase, moved forward at the slow pace of a tortoise. The slow pace was one thing, but the most crucial issue was that, having not showered, none of them looked as polished as they had in Shanghai. The men were fine, their hair looked like a mess, and hats were enough to make it look that way. But the women were in for a real slog. Even beautiful women like Pepper Potts and Black Widow, usually very self-conscious about their appearance, were now slovenly, their hair tangled like a willow. Most importantly, they couldn't shower immediately after arriving at LS, as showering would accelerate oxygen consumption and easily lead to altitude sickness. Fortunately, Tony had secured accommodations before the train arrived, and the hotel had sent a car to pick Sherlock and his companions up. Their slovenly appearance only lasted for the short distance from the train station to the exit. As for Director Fox and the sweet girl Bing Bing, well, the poor kids, since their mission was to promote this most beautiful railway line on the plateau, didn't even bother staying in LS after exiting the train station. They simply turned around and headed back to the ticket office. The workers were truly miserable, compared to Sherlock and his group, who seemed somewhat listless. The driver who came to pick them up was much more lively. He explained the precautions to everyone along the way and even recommended some local delicacies, suggesting they try them once they'd gotten used to the local scene. The hotel they stayed in was arguably one of the best in LS. Upon entering the room, simply opening the curtains revealed a view of the majestic Potala Palace. And to prevent any unexpected incidents, they were assigned 2-to-1 rooms, not one per person, so everyone could take care of each other. After nearly 2 days of train travel, while the scenery was truly breathtaking, the fatigue of the journey still left everyone wanting to rest quickly. Thus, the first day in LS passed in a rather hasty manner, accompanied by the sound of everyone snoring. When Sherlock woke up early the next morning, he felt refreshed, his initial discomfort completely gone. Feeling refreshed, he rushed to the bathroom to clean himself up, but for some reason, he suddenly felt a strong sense of being watched. As a magician, Sherlock had always trusted his intuition, but this was the first time he felt that it wasn't always so accurate. It wasn't surprising that Sherlock felt this way. He had tried every method he could think of, both magical and technological, but couldn't find the source of the spying. Suspicious, Sherlock even checked the entire bathroom thoroughly, but found nothing amiss. The feeling persisted even after he left the bathroom, leading him to wonder if altitude sickness had made him a bit sensitive. Unable to pinpoint the cause, Sherlock could only suppress the strange feeling and temporarily immerse himself in the beautiful view outside the window. After all, they were traveling, and in XZ, known as the world's last secret place, the beautiful scenery was well worth Sherlock's attention. It wasn't surprising that in Sherlock's past life, XZ was the enchantment of many office workers. Its scenery and culture, unlike anywhere else in the world, were truly captivating. The unique plateau environment made it feel like a lost paradise. Sherlock and his group were completely immersed in the unique cultural environment of XZ. At least that was Sherlock's opinion. However, from Sherlock's observation, Zia Okiang, Leo Zhao, and the others didn't seem to be immersed in the culture and scenery, but rather in the barley wine they were trying for the first time. The women, on the other hand, were more immersed in the unique ethnic costumes of the snowy region. They took in every landmark they could, including the Potala Palace, Barker Street, and even every other landmark. Although, in Sherlock's opinion, the sight of his group of foreigners in traditional Tibetan clothing felt strangely off-putting. While the interests of the aforementioned individuals were relatively normal, the interests of Tony and Price, the two oldest members of the group, were rather odd. Perhaps due to their age or some other factor, they were actually interested in unique collectibles found in the snowy region. Sherlock couldn't stop them, and they ended up buying quite a few specialties. As to whether these unique specialties were made in Yiwu or truly vintage as the vendors claimed, it was still unknown. Chapter 308 Snowy Secrets and the Black Cat. The group spent nearly 3 days in LS, during which they visited nearly all of its most famous attractions, with the exception of the Potala Palace, which was visible from their rooms. Because reservations required ID cards, none of their group, except A, B, C, and D, had them. To visit the Potala Palace, they had to rely on A, B, C, and D to try and secure a time. Ultimately, with the help of their coordination, they scheduled a visit to the Potala Palace 10 days later, coinciding with the final stop of their trip. Honestly, Sherlock couldn't be happier with A, B, C, and D he hadn't noticed in Shanghai, but once in LS, the four of them seemed to have transformed. From travel guides and hidden gems to tourist attraction explanations and reservations, they were incredibly skilled. Sherlock even wondered if they were actually taking the civil service exam or the tour guide certification exam. Of course, Sherlock had been haunted by the constant feeling of being watched throughout their time in LS. Even Sherlock, after searching repeatedly with his wand when no one else was around, couldn't find him. It was driving Sherlock a bit nuts. Putting Sherlock's minor issue aside, LS was still beautiful. And there was another unique aspect to visiting LS. It was probably the only place in the whole of Rabbit that required booking a tour after arriving. Indeed, The beauty of the snowy area wasn't in LS itself, but on the way there. But unlike ordinary people, most people simply signed up for a tour and followed the tour guide around. But Sherlock and his group, with Tony's wealthy presence and their large group, had no desire to join a group. Tony simply waved his hand and hired a tour guide. The guide was solely responsible for driving and arranging the route. The rest of the process was off topic. As for the remaining transportation, which was originally the travel agency's responsibility, Tony, the wealthy tycoon, simply bought 4 SUVs locally as a means of transportation. He even used the identities of A, B, C, and D to purchase them, declaring them free gifts and stating that he would only be responsible for the payment. This act of extravagance left A, B, C, and D feeling deeply awed. For the nth time in their lives, they felt the shock of such a wealthy tycoon. Miraculously, as Sherlock left the city of LS, the constant sense of being watched vanished without a trace. This intrigued Sherlock, however, and he decided to focus on the journey first. After all, the scenery he'd seen along the way could only be seen here. True to its reputation as the closest place to heaven, the clouds drifting above gave the impression of being within reach. Sherlock's group was also fortunate, with no bad weather throughout the journey. They didn't miss any of the sights, including Mount Sunshine, Mount Everest, Ninchi, and Yabdrock Lake. They even circumambulated Mount Kailash. Sherlock felt the entire experience as if his legs weren't his own. When he saw the SUV again after the circumambulation, Sherlock felt even happier than when he'd first seen his warehouse of weapons. The most captivating part of the entire trip was the wild hot springs he encountered on the way from the Tibetan Plateau to Selin Lake. No one can resist a natural, steaming foot bath. No one. The group's final day was spent traveling through the Nyankantangla Mountains back to LS. Sherlock actually had many more places he'd wanted to visit, like the Hozil and the unforgettable Medag, but unfortunately, they weren't included in the itinerary. Sherlock didn't force it, thinking, whenever I feel like it, I can just use the portal and come back to continue. After a few days of sightseeing, Sherlock had almost forgotten the feeling of being spied on. However, it wouldn't let him go, and the moment he returned to LS, it flooded back into his mind. It sent Sherlock reeling, nearly losing his mind and blasting away with his wand. What irritated Sherlock the most was this damned peeper, just watching. Just watching. Nothing else to do but observe. He'd be better off confronting him outright. To Sherlock's surprise, this ever-present feeling of being watched vanished the moment he and his group entered the Potala Palace. It was as if some mysterious force had blocked the prying eyes from somewhere. It was so sudden, Sherlock was completely taken aback. When he finally came to his senses, he felt a sense of awe for the Potala Palace. Unnoticed by anyone, a black cat quietly appeared at the end of the group. Sherlock spotted the pitch-black kitten just as he was about to reach the top of the Potala Palace. A cat lover, Sherlock felt no resistance to this little brood of coal, crouching down and waving at a little black cat. Sherlock had initially intended to give the little black cat a fight. After all, cats' nature dictated that they wouldn't trust a human so quickly. But Sherlock never expected that, with just a wave of his hand, the little black cat, as if understanding his intention, would happily run over to Sherlock. After cautiously sniffing Sherlock's fingertips, the once adorable little black cat transformed into a slutty little slut, lying down with its belly exposed in an attempt to seduce Sherlock. He succeeded. Sherlock couldn't resist the little cat's allure and immediately began petting her. And behold, the little cat felt truly delightful. The most amazing thing is that Sherlock only allows this little black cat that came from nowhere to pet it. Anyone else who approaches will be mercilessly puffed away by the little black cat. The most amazing thing is that after Sherlock petted the kitten enough and put it on the ground, this cute kitten actually followed Sherlock like a little dog, ignoring any attempts by others to seduce him. Even if someone directly tried to pick up the kitten would ruthlessly punish him with its claws. Who cannot love a kitten that is exclusively loved by them? Sherlock couldn't do it anyway. In just a few minutes, Sherlock had already fallen in love with this little black cat with no trace of other colors on its body. He even thought about adopting it, but this is the Potala Palace after all, it is someone else's territory. Sherlock didn't know if the kitten was raised by someone in the Potala Palace, so he didn't want to just take it away. Chapter 309 The Magical Little Black Cat. After all, Sherlock is a complete cat lover, and he really has no resistance to the little cat that is acting coquettishly at his feet. Sherlock didn't think much about it, and directly picked up the little black cat at his feet, ready to hold it in his arms and love this charming little cutie. It was not until Sherlock picked up the little black cat that he discovered that there was a small golden copper coin-like pendant hanging around the little black cat's neck, about the size of a fingernail. Generally speaking, stray cats would never have such a valuable pendant, so this little kobold that is very good at acting coquettishly should be a kitten raised in the Potala Palace. Sherlock expressed great regret for this. Sherlock really likes this kitten, not to mention that as a serious wizard, Sherlock still has no pet. Sherlock genuinely disliked pets like owls. After all, the Marvel world didn't require owls for mail delivery. A telephone was more appealing. If you happened to have a Tony Stark nearby, you could even use a 3D projection phone, a far superior technology. Compared to owls, cats perfectly suited Sherlock's expectations. Firstly, Sherlock truly loved cats, and secondly, cats and wizards were a traditional pairing, a perfect match. Most importantly, this kitten was black, perfectly fitting the mythical pairing of witches and black cats from fairy tales around the world. Just as Sherlock was debating whether to ask Person A to ask the Potala Palace staff if he could buy or adopt the kitten, a gentle, deep male voice suddenly spoke from behind him. However, it was in Tibetan, so Sherlock didn't understand a word. Suspecting he'd violated some taboo, Sherlock quickly put down the small black cat he'd been cradling. Ignoring its frantic fussing at his feet, he quickly stood up and turned toward the source of the voice. He saw a kindly-looking llama dressed in snowy clothes. Seeing Sherlock turn, he clasped his hands together, bowed slightly, and began to speak incoherently in Tibetan. Confused, Sherlock turned to look at A, B, C, and D, who had been following the group. This Highland journey depended on these four individuals acting as guides and interpreters, and only A, B, C, and D could understand Tibetan. When Sherlock turned to look at A, who was beside him, A's expression was strange. Sherlock had never seen A look so strange during the entire trip. A's face was also in turmoil, his mind shattered. He looked from the kindly-looking llama to Sherlock, who stood there, bewildered, and hesitant to speak. Seeing A's hesitation, Sherlock finally gave in and slapped A on the shoulder. "What are you staring at? What did the master over there say?" After being slapped by Sherlock, A seemed to finally react and quickly clasped his hands together in a bow to the master. After a brief exchange of words, he turned to Sherlock with a puzzled look and said, "This is the reincarnated living Buddha residing in the Potala Palace. This little black cat is the living Buddha's guardian. Today, the guardian seemed to sense something and ran out and collapsed at your feet." The living Buddha said he'd never seen the guardian so close to someone he'd never seen before. This proves that Sherlock and the guardian are connected, and he hopes Sherlock will adopt the guardian. Sherlock was completely stunned. He had only heard of the living Buddha before, but this time he saw him for real. In his previous life, Sherlock could have scoffed at the idea of a reincarnated living Buddha, but now, Sherlock had experienced a sudden change in his world and mastered mysterious powers like magic. He was in awe of the reincarnated Buddha, and dared not to be. After all, in Sherlock's magical system, while there was no actual means of resurrection, achieving something like this was certainly not difficult. If you don't believe me, just ask Voldemort, the man with the pierced nose, and you'll find out. He used a similar reincarnation technique to control a hapless man named Quirrell in an attempt to find his own nose, though ultimately failed. Filled with awe, Sherlock quickly clasped his hands together and bowed slightly to the seemingly affable Buddha. He asked A to translate for him, expressing his willingness to adopt the little black briquette. After hearing Sherlock's words, A turned to the Buddha with a strange expression on his face and said something. The Buddha, with a look of relief on his face, pulled out a pendant from his pocket, resembling the coin on the kitten's neck, and presented it to Sherlock. Smiling hands placed the charm around Sherlock's neck. Sherlock, with a look of deep awe, politely bowed slightly to accept the living Buddha's gift. Sherlock could sense that while the charm the living Buddha had given him wasn't a product of alchemy or even magic, simply an ordinary charm, for some reason, this supposedly Muggle charm possessed a power similar to magic. Compared to magic, this power felt both holy and ruthless, like a god looking down upon all beings from above. Sherlock didn't know what it was, but out of courtesy, he asked Person A to translate his words of thanks. Person A nodded, and after a few more words with the living Buddha finally nodded in satisfaction, bowed slightly to Sherlock, and turned to leave. As the living Buddha left, Sherlock scooped up the small cold briquettes from the ground and cradled them in his arms, rubbing them repeatedly as he ran over to person A and asked with a sly look on his face. "What exactly did you two just say? I saw you babble for a long time, and you just dismissed me with just a few words." A glanced at Sherlock, who leaned in front of him with a smug look on his face. After taking several deep breaths, he finally addressed Sherlock. "Nothing much, just want to tell you that you'll always be a friend here. No matter what happens in the future, we'll provide you with shelter." Sherlock didn't take A's words to heart. After all, Sherlock didn't think his abilities would lead to the situation A described. But what Sherlock didn't know was that throughout A's conversation with the living Buddha had consistently addressed Sherlock as the highest level of Tibetan Buddhism, a title far higher than the living Buddha himself. A glanced at the smug Sherlock beside him, and couldn't believe he was the one the living Buddha had been talking about as comparable to the Buddha. Chapter 310 The Kitten with Two Tails, Part 1. Photography is prohibited in most areas of the Potala Palace, and Sherlock and his group followed A throughout the tour. Perhaps it was the kitten itself, but along the way, the palace staff and lamas bowed respectfully to Sherlock whenever they saw him, making him nervous and holding the kitten in his arms to return the gesture. The whole scene felt like a missionary work of the Holy Fire Meow cult. When everyone left the Potala Palace, Sherlock, holding the kitten, was pleasantly surprised to find that the prying feeling had completely vanished. Sherlock became even more fond of the kitten, even smiling throughout the entire trip, rubbing its head repeatedly. It felt so good. After their visit to the Potala Palace, their plateau adventure concluded, and they planned to fly home. After all, no one wanted to take another train journey. Taking the train to Tibet had always been Sherlock's dream, but after Sherlock realized his dream, he refused to try it again. After everyone rested in the hotel for a whole day, Tony's plane landed at LS Gonger Airport. Everyone boarded the plane with their trophies, very satisfied. Well, unlike everyone else who left with large bags and small rolls as if fleeing famine, Sherlock only held a kitten in his arms. For Sherlock, this little coal ball could be said to be the most satisfying gain of this trip. Because it was a private plane, there were no such issues as the airline's so-called not allowing pets on board. Sherlock calmly sat in a luxurious recliner holding the kitten, calmly waiting for takeoff. With the roar of the plane engine, the plane soared into the sky like an arrow from a bow. To be honest, planes and trains are completely different. The towering snow-capped mountains we'd seen from the train looked like ant-sized waves from the plane, one layer after another, endless and uninterrupted. Tony even had the plane circle around Mount Everest, fulfilling Sherlock's old saying, "From the summit, I'll see all the other mountains." It must be said that Mount Everest truly lived up to its title as the world's highest mountain. Although everyone had visited Everest Base Camp and gazed up from its foothills at this peak, a mountain featured in textbooks around the world, looking down from the sky now still felt the same immensity, its commanding presence embodied in its fullest. Only then did Sherlock feel that his entire life's textbook education had come full circle, and he truly felt the accuracy of the textbook's description of Mount Everest. After witnessing the majestic Mount Everest, the plane turned and flew back to Yingjiang's home, marking the official end of their journey. Because it was a private jet, Sherlock and his group were the only ones in the cabin, so the atmosphere was much more relaxed than on an airliner. After the plane leveled out around Mount Everest, everyone began to chat. The women shared their beautiful photos and the ethnic-inspired clothing they'd worn on their trip, while the men shared the various small items they'd purchased and the souvenirs they wanted to give away. Sherlock, unfazed by any such concerns, was completely absorbed in petting the kitten in his arms, contentedly listening to its purring. Of course, everyone remembered Sherlock and the adorable kitten on the plane. After a while of chatting, the women first focused their attention on Sherlock's little cutie. As usual, any proximity to the little creature would result in its sweet panting, but the women continued to happily dig out cat treats they bought at some point and try to bribe Sherlock's little darling. Sherlock's two little girls were the most enthusiastic, having already tried dozens of different flavors of cat food. The little ones had never seen such a tempting feast. Initially, they panted at the sight of such a person, then gradually became confused, and finally, they could no longer resist the temptation. They wanted to get out of Sherlock's arms to taste the delicious little food, but as if afraid Sherlock was overthinking it, they kept looking at Sherlock, then at the various flavors of cat food in the women's hands. They seemed to be torn between whether to go or not, and their faces even turned strangely to the conflict. Sherlock's heart melted at the kitten's apprehension in his arms, but he finally gave in to the kitten's pleading expression and gently patted its bottom. Receiving Sherlock's signal, the kitten excitedly jumped out of Sherlock's arms, cautiously testing the cat food in the woman's hands. Finally, captivated by modern technology and the vibrant life, he began frantically licking the cat strips held by the women. Of course, this process was inevitably accompanied by a barrage of petting from the women. Initially repelled and dodging their hands, little Coalball finally surrendered to the delicious taste of the cat strips, allowing them to be touched. Seeing the kitten completely absorbed in the deliciousness and becoming the woman's toy, Sherlock simply smiled and said nothing, focusing his attention on the scenery outside the window. They say that once you visit XZ, everyone leaves their soul behind, taking only their bodies with them. Sherlock now saw how true this saying was. Gazing out at the scenery outside the window, Sherlock felt a strong sense of reluctance. Even Sherlock felt that this wasn't her last trip to XZ. Perhaps she would set foot on this magical land again. Just as Sherlock was lost in his own emotions, a burst of exclamations erupted from the woman petting the cat inside the cabin. Hearing the exclamation, Sherlock quickly turned his gaze over there, only to see Lorna, who had one hand on Little Cole's back, looking at Little Cole's butt in surprise and shouting, "Look, Little Cole has two tails." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelists. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 311 The Kitten with Two Tails, Part 2. Two Tails. Sherlock rushed over immediately after hearing Lorna's exclamation. A closer look confirmed that, just as Lorna had said, this adorable little lump of coal indeed had two tails. However, at first, because the little lump of coal was so black that you couldn't see its features clearly without opening your eyes, and because its two tails were always blending together in Sherlock's arms, Sherlock didn't even notice that this little creature was any different from an ordinary cat. Sherlock examined the little black cat carefully, but ultimately found nothing different. After all, Sherlock was known for his generosity, accepting all cats, whether ordinary or magical. After all, the wizarding world's forefathers, the renowned savior of the first Dark Lord, had taught everyone that sometimes even those magical creatures could be a formidable force. God knows how desperate Grindelwald felt when he looked at the army of magical creatures summoned by Newt. Damn it, everyone else was fighting one-on-one, but now it was his turn. What a summoning game. Despite his carefree nature, Sherlock was still curious about the little creature's species. True to Marvel lore, Sherlock's first thought was the creature with the name Fat Orange and pronounced Eater. Unfortunately, Sherlock picked up the little creature and, under its bewildered gaze, examined it for a long time, but couldn't find any signs of an eater. Sherlock even pulled out his wand, but the final result was a regular kitten with two tails. Although Sherlock was certain his results were wrong, he couldn't figure out what was wrong, so he finally gave up. Just pretend it was just a cute, cuddly, ordinary kitten. Sherlock picked up the kitten and sucked on its belly repeatedly, thinking to himself, that's right, it's just an ordinary kitten." Sherlock stared at the two girls, who were looking at him as if he were a pervert, and then put down the kitten, whose eyes were rolling from Sherlock's sucking, and said to the others. Sherlock's response was a collective ire from the women, who all raised their middle fingers in admiration. Amidst the clamor and laughter in the cabin, the plane quickly landed in New York, behind Sherlock's family's training ground. The benefits of having a runway at home were immediately apparent. After disembarking, he could simply throw himself, exhausted, into his soft bed. As for the plane, well, Tony declared that this ordinary passenger jet had absolutely no business being in the hangar he treated as a workshop. After dropping everyone off, the wealthy Tony performed a series of takeoffs and landings before returning to the New York airport. Life returned to its peaceful state. Hawkeye, who had been forced to stay home to watch over the team-building trip, had also received a slew of gifts from everyone. Sherlock's gift was the most damning of all. Have you ever seen a kind person bring a newborn baby a complete set of kindergarten to high school supplementary materials, in both Chinese and English, complete with courseware? Finally, Hawkeye, with a scowl, threw Sherlock out the door, screaming, "Pay attention to your child's education." There are only 4,000 days left until the college entrance exam. While Sherlock's philosophy was sound, And Hawkeye also wanted his child to receive a so-called elite education. That didn't mean he had to start working hard for the little one, who wasn't even a month old yet. Hawkeye felt his child still deserved a wonderful childhood. Of course, aside from this minor incident, the rest of the day went on much like before. Sherlock's family training ground was back in business, and with the expansion and increased subject offerings, business was booming. Sherlock's 5 uncles and 2 little girls were once again, armed with guns and spewing obscenities, training the unfortunate individuals sent there by the various powers. Meanwhile, Black Widow and Hawkeye began to find time to systematically train Antonia, with Tony occasionally creating some sort of simulated real-life training session for the 3 of them. It seems that everyone from Tony to Black Widow to Hawkeye is interested in recruiting Antonia into the Avengers. Of course, there's also Captain America, Falcon, and Hulk. Although they weren't at Sherlock's training grounds and didn't participate in this team-building event, everyone still left their gifts in the rooms they built for them. But, well, those gifts, well, how should I put it, ranged from a pack of cigarettes to a complete set of clothes. Of course, there are some differences, the most obvious being Sherlock. Sherlock now has a little tail he can't shake off. Wherever Sherlock goes, this 2-tailed kitten follows him closely, even occasionally landing on his shoulder or head as a living pendant. And since Sherlock and the others discovered he's a 2-tailed kitten, for some reason, his tails haven't gotten tangled again. And according to Sherlock, his 2 tails are incredibly flexible, and most interestingly, they can each swing independently, making for a truly captivating experience. It was Sherlock's first time witnessing a 3-way brawl between a tail, and the kitten's true form. The scene was so chaotic that even Sherlock, a seasoned veteran, wasn't sure whether to intervene. Of course, there were occasional moments of uncommon harmony, like when the little one found something it particularly enjoyed, its 2 tails would coordinate to form a perfect heart. This discovery sent the women at the training ground into a frenzy over the kitten, constantly offering all sorts of treats to try and entice the steadfastly attached kitten. After just a few days, Sherlock noticed the little one had gained considerable weight, even beginning to develop the characteristics of a primal devourer. He quickly stopped them. While the gascon was adorable, Sherlock, for the sake of his spine and cervical vertebrae, ruthlessly shut down these insane women. After all, having a gascon against your head wasn't exactly a pleasant experience, and Sherlock wasn't the 3rd brother, he wasn't used to it. Of course, aside from that, what Sherlock couldn't understand the most was how could little Coldball, a pure bunny cat, actually understand English? Damn it, Sherlock couldn't believe his English couldn't even compare to that of a cute little cat. After all, the main reason Sherlock could speak English fluently as a mother tongue was thanks to his time travel. Otherwise, well, you know what they mean by CET4 is the chasm I'll never get over? Chapter 312 Animagus, Part 1. After returning home, Sherlock spent a week inactive. This time, he truly lived the life of an ancient young master, cultivating the land, playing with his cats and dogs, and occasionally taking his bird for a walk. As for why so many small animals suddenly appeared in Sherlock's home, the reason was simple: Sherlock stopped the Black Widows from trying to tease his little Coldball. The Black Widows, who had been eyeing Coldball covetously, eventually transferred their affection for him to other small animals. Suddenly, a pet-keeping craze swept the Black Widows throughout the training grounds. From raptors and eagles to giant bears and crickets and insects, Sherlock felt like he had almost completed a biology syllabus. And with so many animals, it was inevitable that your pet would become my pet's food. To maintain harmony in his home, Sherlock had no choice but to use a potion specifically designed for taming animals. Sherlock had stumbled upon this thing in the corner of a vending machine in his library. Honestly, it wasn't very useful. It just allowed wild animals to understand human speech, slightly boosting their intelligence and making them more docile and affectionate. Beyond that, it was completely useless. Besides pets, it was completely useless for anything else. It also had a strong, fishy taste, far from being delicious. Come to think of it, why else would so many owls in Harry Potter obey wizards? There must be some trickery involved. The Black Widows, upon receiving the potion, were overjoyed and fed it to their pets. Of course, this was only for animals. Sherlock didn't give any to insects. For one thing, the potion didn't work on insects, and for another, most of the Black Widows who liked insects were insect fighters. So, they weren't pets, they were fighters. Sherlock was horrified by the replacement and consumption rates. If they truly were to provide potions, even if all the gold in the world were consumed, it wouldn't be enough for these people to produce. Of course, thanks to Sherlock's actions, life became even more miserable for the unfortunate students at Sherlock's training ground. After all, combat training used to involve fighting humans, but now it involved battling ferocious beasts like wolves, tigers, leopards, bears, and black bears. Fighting was fine, though. Winning was fine. Losing, while not hurt, would earn you the animal's disdainful looks. Yes, disdainful looks. God knows how deeply he'd been shaken by a brown bear standing over 3 meters tall looking at him with such disdain, as if to say, "You little dog, you dare to fight me." Suddenly, the atmosphere at the training ground was as intense as ever. After all, running with wolves, cheetahs, lions, and other ferocious beasts chasing after you meant fighting like hell. While they wouldn't kill you, these beasts would bite you if you ran slower, without mercy. Almost everyone on the training grounds now had 2 bite marks on their buttocks. Of course, the training grounds were so intense, the students' enthusiasm was forcibly aroused every day, so Sherlock naturally didn't sit idle. He passively took Sherlock with him and began his own training. That's right, with some free time, Sherlock finally remembered the final transfiguration spell he'd been talking about so many times, the animagus. Sherlock was curious about what he would become, so he began his animagus training. However, the training process was truly dreadful. Just look at the instructions in the book 1. For a full month, from full moon to full moon, you must hold a single mandrake leaf in your mouth. You may not swallow the leaf or remove it from your mouth at any time. If you do, the entire process must be restarted too. When the moon is full, remove the leaf and soak it in saliva in a small crystal vial, allowing it to absorb the pure moonlight. If the night is overcast, you will have to find a new mandrake leaf and start over. Into the moonlit crystal vial, add a strand of your hair and a silver teaspoon of dew, collected from a place where there has been no sunlight or human contact for 7 days. Finally, add a chrysalis moth. Keep this mixture in a quiet, dark place, and do not look at or disturb it until the next thunderstorm 3. While waiting for the storm to arrive, perform the following at sunrise and sunset. Point the tip of your wand to your heart and chant the incantation, Amato, Animato, Animagus. The first 3 steps alone are enough to make one feel hopeless, not to mention the 60 or 80 steps that follow. Sherlock was stuck on the first step alone for about 2 months. If Sherlock placed a damn leaf under his tongue, he'd easily swallow it. Even spitting it out during sleep was a real problem. For 2 whole months, Sherlock's hair was a mess, and he couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes. He looked like the empty young man he once was. As for why Sherlock was like this, you'd be like this if you couldn't sleep or eat well for a month. That damn second step was even more frustrating. Who knows why they had to fill a small bottle with saliva? Wasn't it just a test of his oral glands? And damn, he had to drink it himself at the end, a whole bottle of saliva. Just thinking about it made Sherlock sick. He seriously doubted the mental state of the person who invented this magic. Of course, Sherlock's animagus training was watched by everyone around him. Everyone was curious about his magic. After all, they'd never seen how it was done. Being able to observe Sherlock's animagus training with their own eyes was a rare experience for them. Facts have proved that Sherlock is a time traveler after all, and God still takes care of Sherlock. After completing the first 2 most difficult steps, the conditions for the remaining steps were all gathered in just 1 month. So, under the watchful eyes of the Avengers, some Black Widows, Sherlock's 5 uncles, 2 Lawless, and Little Cole, on a night before a storm, after the first lightning appeared in the sky, Sherlock drank the potion that had been brewed for more than a month in 1 gulp, pointed his wand at his heart, and recited a spell that Sherlock had been waiting for a long time. Amato, Animato, Animagus. Chapter 313 Animagus, Part 2. Amidst a deafening rumble of thunder, far slower than the lightning, Sherlock's body began to transform. His entire body rapidly shrank and curled up, a black bony beak gradually forming on his mouth. His eyes turned blood red, and a dazzling array of black feathers began to appear on his body. Sherlock paid no attention to the changes. The reason was simple. The moment Sherlock cast the animagus spell at the first flash of lightning, a powerful heartbeat erupted from his body. As the heartbeat grew louder, this sudden second heartbeat gradually merged with Sherlock's own, their frequency becoming uniform. As the 2 heartbeats merged, they became a single, deafening thump. Sherlock didn't even hear the thunder outside. As he pondered what was about to happen, a sharp pain instantly spread throughout his body. He felt as if his flesh and bones were being torn, twisted, and crushed by an invisible force. But due to the potion and the magic, Sherlock couldn't even faint in the face of such excruciating pain. He could only rely on willpower to resist, but willpower has its limits. Sherlock himself didn't know how long he held out. Could it have been a moment, an hour, a day, a year? Sherlock didn't know. Just when Sherlock was about to give up, the pain that had devoured his mind faded as quickly as a spring, as if it had never existed. Instead, an indescribable urge emerged. An impulse rooted in the most instinctive beast began to invade Sherlock's mind. Fortunately, Sherlock was refreshed at this time. And with a previous experience of being affected by the obscurus, Sherlock never gave up on occlumency. Even when traveling, Sherlock did not forget to practice occlumency every day. Hard work pays off. Despite the animalistic instincts that surged through Sherlock's brain like a tide, Sherlock remained clear-minded, fully aware of himself as Sherlock, a time traveler, the only true wizard in the world. Therefore, the most difficult part of the animagus process seemed as easy as eating and drinking water to Sherlock. It presented no challenge at all. However, it was also this powerful animalistic instinct that allowed Sherlock to understand the true nature of his animagus, a raven, a symbol of death. After battering Sherlock's mind for a while without success, this animalistic instinct slowly receded like a tide, and Sherlock had truly completed his first animagus transformation. Of course, Sherlock didn't want to return to his human form immediately. After all, this was the first time in his 2 lifetimes combined that he had transformed into a bird, and he certainly wanted to experience such a novelty. Curiously, Sherlock extended one of his dark bird claws, wanting to test his new body. As expected, his beak made intimate contact with the ground. Well, it's no wonder Sherlock acted like this. After all, it was his first time being a bird, and he was slowly learning the ropes. Under normal circumstances, if Sherlock had fallen flat on his face, everyone in the training ground who knew him would have come running to laugh at him. But now, although everyone Sherlock knew was watching Sherlock's animagus, no one laughed at him as he stumbled over his left foot. Everyone's face was filled with the same expression of shattered perspective. What had they seen? Sherlock had just transformed, before everyone's eyes, from a human into a raven with blood-red eyes and a body larger than a normal crow. You have to know that while Sherlock could use magic normally, everyone was more receptive to his other magic, whether it was explosions, fire, or those colorful beams of light, or even the ability to alter matter and terrain. After all, in their view, while these spells were powerful and miraculous, they ultimately followed the same pattern as human ammunition fired from weapons. In their subconscious, Sherlock's wand-fired magic was essentially the same as a bullet fired from a gun. But now, Sherlock had spent 2 full months preparing his magic, and everyone had practically watched as Sherlock transformed from a human into a bird. The species had completely changed. Tony, in particular, had a look on his face as if science had ceased to exist, biology had collapsed. He couldn't understand why Sherlock had transformed from a human into a bird, given that the DNA of humans and birds was completely different, even more so than that of humans and dogs. Sherlock had no idea what everyone was thinking. Sherlock was brimming with joy as he experimented with his new body, like a child with a new toy. They practically watched as Sherlock, seemingly unable to even walk, gradually began to take steps, gradually progressing from constantly tripping and falling to running freely like a crow. The entire process was incredibly quick, as if a child's entire childhood had been condensed into just a few minutes. Of course, walking was just the beginning for Sherlock. What Sherlock truly desired was flight. As a dream that had existed since the dawn of humankind, the dream of soaring into the sky was irresistible to all humans. From ancient times to the present, all the powerful gods and demons that humans have yearned for, even the mighty beings in movies and TV series, were all capable of self-sufficiency. Sherlock considered himself immortal, so naturally, he was no exception. For the first time in his life, as a bird, Sherlock slowly spread his wings. Perhaps because he was a size larger than a typical raven, his wingspan far exceeded that of a typical raven. As his wings unfolded, Sherlock glanced at the glossy black feathers and, following the animal instincts that came with his transformation, began flapping his wings. With each flap, Sherlock soared through the sky under his own power for the first time in his life, emitting a clear cry. Although Sherlock's cry sounded clear to him, It still sounded unpleasant to the onlookers, like a crow's cry. Lorna, who had been following Price, tugged at his arm as they watched Sherlock soar into the sky and merge into the thick black clouds. Uncle Price, so now it's brother Sherlock who's turned into a bird and flown away. Chapter 314 Tony's Surgery, Part 1. After a night of storms, Sherlock's training grounds returned to their usual state. The training grounds were still filled with a roar of testosterone, while the Avengers' quarters remained a harmonious scene. The only difference was a raven, considerably larger than the others, resting on Tony's shoulder. That raven on Tony's shoulder was none other than Sherlock himself. What? Why didn't Sherlock cancel his animagus transformation? Haha, Sherlock wondered. Even Sherlock himself had no idea why animagus potions had that damn fixed entry. After all, according to the magic classifications in Sherlock's library, animagus should be classified as ancient ritual magic. That so-called potion was actually part of ritual magic, so it shouldn't be considered a potion. But the truth was so uncanny, this thing fermented by Sherlock's saliva was actually considered a potion. Fortunately, compared to regular potions, this one had no strange side effects. It simply locked Sherlock in his animagus state for 24 hours. In other words, Sherlock wouldn't be able to actively undo his animagus transformation until tonight. Of course, these were minor issues for Sherlock, and he wasn't particularly concerned. The only thing that puzzled him was the entry currently hanging over his head. Deathbird, entry locked, time limit. 10 hours, 33 minutes, and 56 seconds. That's right, Sherlock's transformation had been locked into an entry called Deathbird, and this damn entry didn't even have a damn explanation. Sherlock hadn't thought about transforming into one of those so-called magical creatures, and had tried hard to see if he had any magical powers. But Alice, none. At least, Sherlock hadn't discovered any yet. Last night, when she had some free time, Charlotte had even carefully reviewed all the books on magical creatures she'd read in the library. There was no mention of the Deathbird, as if it had never existed. While there were stories of such creatures in the real world, most were fabricated myths and lacked any relevance. So Sherlock decided to leave it as it was for now. After all, once the entry was over, he'd be back in human form. Whether or not it was a magical beast would be revealed later. Even if it was, Sherlock felt he had earned his stripes as the only person in the world to have mastered the animagus transformation of a magical creature. In the Harry Potter universe, this would be even more unique, worthy of an Order of Merlin, first class, as a testament to his impressive accomplishments. Of course, if there was any real wonder about Sherlock's transformation, it was that after transforming, he could actually understand the meaning of all the birds' calls. And so, the originally beautiful words, "the beautiful morning sun," accompanied by the sound of bird song, were now lost on Sherlock. After all, it's only when you don't understand that the bird song is so unusually clear and melodious. Now that you can understand, Sherlock knows just how filthy these seemingly harmless birds are. It's safe to say that while the early bird catches the worm, it also makes you mad. Putting Sherlock's little aside, there was another major event at the training ground today, Tony's decision to surgically repair the large hole in his chest caused by the reactor. This was also one of the gifts Tony had originally planned for Pepper Potts. The reason they hadn't taken action yet was partly due to the team-building event Sherlock had arranged. And partly because no one in the US could find a surgeon capable of performing Tony's surgery. This wasn't some fantasy. If you were to rank surgeons worldwide, the rabbits would undoubtedly be at the top. The rabbits' vast population meant that their surgeons had far more experience than those in foreign countries, where the population was already sparse and often prone to suicide. During their last trip to the rabbits' home, Pepper had asked A, B, C, and D to help contact a top thoracic surgeon. They wanted to perform surgery on Tony to remove the tiny fragments from his chest and free him from the reactor. Now, word has arrived that Tony's doctor is ready and will depart for Eagle Sauce immediately. It's unclear if it was Sherlock's transformation last night or the babbling he experienced after that touched Tony. Tony, who has a strong aversion to being touched, actually set a date for the surgery. When Tony announced the news at breakfast, everyone congratulated him, even Sherlock, who was still a bird. However, because he was a bird, Sherlock could only make bird noises, which made Tony's face darken. He told Sherlock, "If you can, please transform into human form before speaking, as it's unlucky otherwise." Sherlock was speechless at Tony's sarcasm. But he was his uncle after all, and even with the world's top surgeons performing the surgery, no one could guarantee success. Therefore, Sherlock's first action after returning to human form was to find Tony and Pepper, offering to enter Tony's operating room as a last resort. While Sherlock lacked medical expertise, he guaranteed that even if the surgery failed, he could return Tony to his chest to the state he had when the reactor was installed. Regardless of the success or failure of the surgery, Sherlock was certain Tony would survive. Tony, though reluctant, was persuaded by Pepper's agreement and immediately began discussing the matter with the doctors. Dr. Wu, who performed Tony's surgery, was puzzled as to why the patient insisted on Sherlock, a non-medical surgeon, being in the operating room. However, reflecting on his mission and his mission to save lives, he ultimately agreed to Pepper's request. The only requirement is that Sherlock cannot delay the operation. Sherlock doesn't care about this. After all, if nothing happens, Sherlock would probably be playing games with the anesthesiologist the whole time. There is no need to perform magic in front of everyone, right? Chapter 315 Tony's Surgery, Part 2. As it turned out, Sherlock's worries were completely unfounded. Dr. Wu, the rabbit, possessed impeccable surgical skills. Sherlock and the anesthesiologist spent almost the entire operation slacking off. They played everything from Bakeo Garden to Sanwa e-bookstore, playing King of Glory, League of Legends, PUBG, and even Dark Zone. From playing Turtle Shooter to Golden Hook, from Go Bang to chess, from flying chess to Monopoly, Sherlock and the anesthesiologist were engaged in a frenzy in the corner of the operating room. They'd practically forgotten every conceivable two-player game, ancient or modern. After 10 hours of surgery, Sherlock had an impressive record of 2 wins, 3 draws, and 52 losses. These 2 victories were only achieved when Sherlock, incredibly naive, was so frustrated by a loss in chess that he pretended to close his eyes and think, while frantically playing the human-computer version of chess in his library with a spare phone. As for the 3 draws, it was all thanks to Sherlock's Gamoku skills, which he'd mastered while playing with his friends in school in his previous life. Looking at his eagle-like performance, Sherlock's face took on the look of a typical old man on the subway. Seeing Sherlock's expression, as if he'd eaten shit, the anesthesiologist smiled faintly. Young people are still too naive. I've been slacking off in operating rooms for decades. How can a pretty boy like you compare? Although Sherlock didn't play any role during the surgery, as an uncle, Tony was grateful for Sherlock's presence. Tony was also very happy to be free of the reactor in his chest, and he happily enjoyed Pepper's meticulous care. What? Why didn't you ask Sherlock to use some magic potion to recover quickly? Nonsense. How could he enjoy Pepper's meticulous care after recovering? That would be a complete loss. So Tony, quite unwisely, came up with a lousy plan. Even before leaving the operating room, Tony, barely conscious, pulled Sherlock aside to ask if there was a less potent potion. He didn't want to recover so quickly. If all else failed, he could even take a potion that had already healed and diluted it with some water. Just don't let him recover so quickly. Sherlock couldn't help but give Tony, who had just regained consciousness, a look of disdain, but Tony didn't seem to care. Once inside the ward, Tony, taking advantage of a quiet moment, explained his understanding of the point of dilution 1001. My goodness, 1 drop of potion in 1,000 drops of water? You really just diluted potion with some water? No, you just diluted water with a little potion. Sherlock was shocked by Tony's understanding of the unit of measurement for point, a leading figure in science. I don't understand it, but I'm deeply shocked. Of course, as her uncle, Tony wouldn't let Sherlock remain confused for long. Once Pepper and the doctor had gone through the post-operative precautions and returned to the ward, Sherlock almost immediately understood Tony's mischievous intentions. The glances between them were utterly piercing. Pepper's gaze at Tony was filled not only with deep love but also with a strong maternal instinct. Sherlock, his mouth full of dog food, stared at the couple and couldn't think of a proper scolding. Ultimately, he could only offer a lame excuse like I'm worried the potion will regenerate too quickly and affect the wound's healing. Then, as Tony had said, he threw down a bottle of healing potion made from a little potion in water and hurried off. He had no choice but to leave. She'd been stuffed with dog food, and if she didn't leave, she'd get fat. Tony's discharge from the hospital was remarkably quick, not much different from back home. After about a week, Tony packed up and headed home. After all, the hospital was convenient, and going home was definitely better than staying there. The only real problem was that the rest of the community suffered. Whenever they saw Tony alone, everyone tacitly gave him the universal friendly sign of friendship, a damn jerk who was always showing off his affection. Of course, back home, Sherlock, aside from occasionally giving Tony some watered-down potions, was mostly back to his usual rambunctious self. But this time, Sherlock's rambling had completely changed. Now, around the training grounds, you could often see a two-tailed cat with a black raven, its eyes bloodshot, perched on its back. You know what? Becoming an animal changed the way he saw the world. The once familiar training grounds felt like a place he'd never seen before. Sherlock explored every little corner usually invisible to humans due to his size. So far, he'd spotted at least 5 small animal gatherings within his training grounds. To Sherlock, the gatherings remarkably resembled a bar in the Eagle Sauce, and it was remarkable how these animals could find these merchandise amidst the discarded human junk. All in all, it felt magical, reminiscent of Disney's Zootopia. Of course, Sherlock couldn't remain a bird forever, he still had to pay for everyone's meals. Perhaps everyone's tastes had become spoiled during their last team-building trip to Shanghai and LS. While they'd occasionally indulge in traditional Western fare like steak and chips or pizza, most of the time, they preferred Sherlock's authentic Chinese cuisine. It had to be authentic Chinese food. Few people wanted to eat Western-style Chinese food anymore. When Sherlock first crossed over, out of curiosity, he'd actually tried the so-called local Chinese food. The taste, well, it was unforgettable. Forget about the dishes Sherlock had never heard of in his previous life on the rabbit side, like General Tso's chicken. The flavor was just that, sweet and sour, sweet and sour. Sherlock simply declined. Of course, after eating more, Sherlock understood why Chinese cuisine held a scorn for foreign cuisine. Chinese food was all about well-prepared ingredients, and the portions were easily edible. Western-style dishes, like steak, were far too gruesome to eat without a knife and fork. Everyone lived a simple and happy life, and Sherlock even thought it could last forever. But fate would not let Sherlock rest in peace. Just a few days later, when Sherlock was standing on the back of his little coal ball and playing guy, a colorful light suddenly fell from the sky. Chapter 316, Little Coal Ball's Extraordinary Identity? That's right, it was Asgard's rainbow bridge that fell from the sky. Sherlock didn't even have time to react before he and his little brute were transported, stunned, right in front of Heimdall. At the entrance to the rainbow bridge, Thor stood behind Heimdall, looking in anticipation. When a two-tailed cat emerged, accompanied by a raven perched on its back, Thor was stunned as if he had seen a ghost. Do you know what it means to jump 3 feet high? Sherlock witnessed it firsthand. The moment Sherlock and his little brute appeared at the entrance to the rainbow bridge, Thor leaped over 3 feet high, as if he had seen something truly terrifying. Before Sherlock could react, the Meow Hammer flew out of the Asgardian palace and landed in Thor's hand. Thor immediately went into combat mode, staring intently at Sherlock's bird and cat. On the other side, although Heimdall didn't look as nervous as Thor and acted like he was about to fight, he also looked at the bird and cat that appeared at the entrance of the rainbow bridge with a wary face. Looking at the two nervous people, Sherlock felt a touch of happiness for the first time. You always summon me for no reason, and now you're scared because you made a mistake this time? Damn it, I finally fought back against that old bastard Thor. Sherlock glanced at the two nervous people with his scarlet eyes, and then changed back to his original appearance. Watching Sherlock transform from a bird into human, Thor did not show the surprised expression Sherlock imagined. He still stared at Sherlock in a defensive posture, well, or rather, stared at the little coal ball at Sherlock's feet. Of course, the little coal ball also couldn't stand Thor. Since he appeared in Asgard, he kept breathing on Thor and Heimdall. Finally, Sherlock couldn't stand it anymore. He scooped up the small coal ball, held it in his arms, and stroked it vigorously in front of Thor and Heimdall's horrified eyes. Seeing that the small coal ball no longer showed hostility towards Thor and Heimdall, he placed it on the top of his head. The small coal ball seemed to be indifferent to the two strong men, purring happily as Sherlock stroked it. When Sherlock placed the small coal ball on his head, it suddenly turned into liquid, spreading out on Sherlock's head like a cat pancake. Seeing Thor and Heimdall still wary, Sherlock looked at them with an expression that almost looked like an idiot. After a while, when they didn't show any sign of letting up, Sherlock couldn't help but speak. Say, what's wrong with you two? Why are you acting like you're facing a great enemy? Hearing Sherlock's calm tone, Thor's voice trembled a little. He raised his hammer and waved at Sherlock with a trembling hand. "Sherlock, my brother. Get the thing off your head and come over here. Hurry. It's killing me." Hearing Thor's nervous expression, Sherlock rolled his eyes in annoyance. He scratched the chin of the little coal ball that had been spread out like a cat pancake on his head with his index finger. Listening to the coal ball's purring, he complained to Thor. "Don't worry, it's just a little earth kitten, not a devourer. I checked it out. Don't be so nervous. It would have been fine if Sherlock hadn't said anything." After he finished speaking, Thor's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Especially when he saw the kitten purring happily as Sherlock tickled its chin, Thor asked with a trembling voice. As if he had witnessed a miracle he couldn't believe in his entire life. "Tell me the truth, bro, you really don't have a side job or a hidden identity?" Hearing Thor's words, Sherlock rolled his eyes in annoyance and immediately responded with a barrage of criticism. "What the hell is this about a hidden identity? What's wrong with you? Tell me now, and then tell me why you're looking for me." "Stop looking for trouble." Sensing Sherlock's impatience, Thor glanced at Sherlock, then at the lumps of coal on Sherlock's head. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. After a while, Thor gradually let go of his desperate look and gradually returned to normal. Although he looked normal on the surface, Heimdall, standing next to Thor, could still see that Thor's muscles were tense. "Did you know? The thing on top of your head is not a real kitten, nor is it an element devourer. It is a thing that is more terrifying than an element devourer, and there are legends about it throughout the universe. Legend has it that if there is a place where a massacre or disaster is about to happen, well, in short, when there will be a large number of casualties, this little guy will appear there, and will quietly disappear afterwards. It's not that no one wants to catch this little guy and find out the truth, but without exception, anyone who gets close to this little guy will lose their life, and their death will be extremely miserable. So far, no one in the entire universe can truly own the little thing on top of your head. Everyone says that it is the embodiment of death, the real pet of the god of death, an existence that helps the god of death reap lives." Listening to Thor's introduction to the little guy on top of his head, Sherlock exclaimed, "What a guy." Hearing this, he picked up the little coal ball on the top of his head and held it in front of him to observe it. Seeing his little coal ball being picked up and its body drooping stupidly into a long cat shape, Sherlock looked at the little cat in front of him, and then looked at Thor, who was not far away, with a terrified face. "Good man, are you sure this silly, soft little thing is the symbol of death you are talking about? This thing is the pet of the god of death you are talking about? Don't be ridiculous. Why would the god of death keep this thing? Is it to be cute?" Sherlock didn't believe a word of Thor's statement, and rolled his eyes at Thor in annoyance. In the horrified eyes of Thor and Heimdall, he buried his face in the belly of the little coal ball and took a deep breath. It tastes right." After taking a breath of the cat, Sherlock seemed to have regained his spirit. He threw the confused little coal ball on his head again, and then turned to Thor and Heimdall, who were standing not far away. "Come on, stop talking nonsense. Tell me, what do you want from me again?" Chapter 317, The Unforgivable Curse Enhanced by Epic Level. Watching Sherlock sucking on what they considered an absolutely dangerous beast like a cat, Thor's eyelids nearly popped out, and he began to shake his head. Especially after Sherlock finished sucking, his expression still like, "Really? I don't believe it. You got a fart." Thor was even more speechless. For a moment, Thor had the look of someone who wanted to say something, but couldn't. But as Sherlock's good friend, Thor decided to persuade his good friend again. After all, this little guy had a bad reputation. In Thor's opinion, with Sherlock's suicidal behavior, his small body was no match for the thing he had just sucked. But just as Thor was about to speak, Odin's voice rang out from the Asgard palace on the other side of the Rainbow Bridge. "Thor, bring your friends." Odin was a million miles away from the three of them, but his voice seemed to be right next to them. Sherlock didn't care. After all, in terms of strength, Odin was a godlike powerhouse, and in terms of seniority, he was his friend's father. Whether from the perspective of respecting the strong or respecting the elders, since Odin had spoken, Sherlock should go. But Thor obviously didn't think so. The difference in their appearances on the Rainbow Bridge was huge. Sherlock, with a small coal ball on his head, walked in a square step, looking like he was enjoying the mountains and rivers, heading towards the Asgard palace at the end of the Rainbow Bridge. Thor, following behind Sherlock, looked like a Japanese invader invading the village. He carefully stared at the small coal ball on Sherlock's head that had turned into liquid, and the meow hammer in his hand was always ready to go. Looking at the two figures, if you didn't know, you would think Sherlock was the Prince of Asgard. Fortunately, they didn't encounter many people along the way, and little coal ball didn't bother to pay attention to the nervous golden retriever behind him. He rested contentedly on Sherlock's head and followed Sherlock into the Palace of Asgard. The Palace of Asgard was much the same as Sherlock's last visit. Odin, holding his Spear of Eternity, sat aloft on the throne, watching the two people enter. He watched Sherlock walk in with ease and bow slightly, his entire demeanor graceful. Then, looking at his son, looking so nervous, like a Japanese soldier entering a village, wary of a guerrilla attack, Odin couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Damn, who did this silly kid take after? Of course, Sherlock didn't know what Odin was thinking. He bowed slightly to Odin, following the same etiquette he had the last time the Ancient One brought him here. Respected Odin, I wonder what you've summoned me for. Hearing Sherlock's question, Odin shifted his attention from his foolish son to the coal ball atop Sherlock's head. He then addressed Sherlock. My child, the moment you arrived, I sensed the strong aura of the power of death within the palace. That's why I summoned you, wanting to know what's going on. After all, you're Thor's friend, aren't you? It would have been better if Odin hadn't said anything, but after he finished, Sherlock was stunned. The power of death? Sherlock didn't directly answer Odin's question about what had happened, but instead asked a question that interested him. Yes, the aura of the power of death? It's just that the aura you carry is incomplete, I can feel it. But it's the very real power of death? Your power has even surpassed that of a true god. Reaching a power close to law. I can sense that once you complete this power, you'll almost instantly surpass that god and slay everything in the world, including him. As Odin finished speaking, Sherlock almost immediately recalled his unfinished melon-eating spell, which had been under the influence of the obscure. To this day, Sherlock still vividly remembers that indescribable feeling of dread. This time, Sherlock had finally found the source. He had never imagined that his Kesservanshi had been dramatically enhanced in the Marvel Universe. You see, in the HP universe, the Kesservanshi is considered the most vicious and powerful black magic, unstoppable by any spell. But family knows family. While no spell can stop it, its armor-piercing ability is roughly the same as that of a trembling object. It's not like there isn't any, there really isn't any. Any physical object can stop the progress of the killing curse. Therefore, in HP magic, most people would use transfiguration spells or simply rely on their physical agility to avoid the unnerving green light. But now, my goodness, listen to what Odin told Sherlock? Kill everything. This statement is truly powerful. You have to know that if it's really as Odin said, then even against Captain America's shield, Sherlock can only fire 2 spells at most. The first one will kill the shield, and the second one will kill Captain America. This is terrifying, considering the vibranium in Captain America's shield is arguably one of the finest metals in the Marvel Universe. And most importantly, the unforgivable curse corrodes the mind. You have to know that the first few torture spells almost brought Sherlock's sanity to 0. What about this epically enhanced killing curse? No one can resist the feeling of controlling the life and death of everything in the world. Sherlock couldn't even imagine what it would take for the entire planet to wake up if he hadn't woken up and truly transformed into a madman like Voldemort, devouring everything he could. And most crucially, there was the deity Odin was referring to. Although she never appeared in the movies, Sherlock knew she was the goddess of death from the Celestials in the comics. After all, this was the real world, not just a movie. Just because she didn't appear in the movies didn't mean she didn't exist in the real world. Furthermore, the Kelpie curse had been significantly enhanced. He'd already experimented with the Torment curse, but what about the Imperious curse? In the Marvel Universe, the soul was the ultimate currency among the powerful. It was food, a source of power, a bargaining chip. Even the Infinity Stones had a dedicated gem dedicated to the soul, so you could imagine how important it truly was. If the soul was so important, would the Imperious curse, which could completely control it, be equally enhanced? At that moment, Sherlock admitted to panicking. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 318, little coal ball is actually a yuan-devouring beast? Watching Sherlock's face gradually drenched in sweat, Odin wanted to say something, but ultimately sighed helplessly. After all, in Odin's view, Sherlock was still a disciple of the Ancient One, and there were things he couldn't directly address. What he had just said was enough. Seeing Sherlock panic, Odin finally offered a soothing reassurance. Don't worry, that deity isn't one to hold grudges, and your aura isn't complete. As long as you don't appear before her, she won't find you. Sherlock breathed a sigh of relief after hearing Odin's words. Sherlock truly didn't want to confront the Celestials right now. Especially the most mysterious of them, the goddess of death, was a bit intimidating. But before Sherlock could fully relax, a soft meow echoed from above. Under normal circumstances, Sherlock would have hugged the little coal ball perched on his head, letting out a strange laugh and yelling, "Little slut, you seduced me first." Then he held the little coal ball in his arms and pampered it until the little coal ball couldn't stand the mess of its fur being rubbed by Sherlock and jumped out of Sherlock's arms. But now, when the little coal ball cried out, Sherlock's mind was full of what Thor had just said to him. This guy is the pet of the god of death. The pet of the god of death. Pet? Sherlock felt a little bit uneasy. Is this considered a crime before his husband's eyes? Not only did he steal someone's authority, but he also stole someone's pet? Seeing Sherlock's face immediately become colorful after the little coal ball cried out, how could Odin, who was already old and shrewd, not know what Sherlock was thinking? He waved his hand at Sherlock with a smile on his face and continued. If nothing unexpected happens, you probably heard from Thor that the thing on your head is some kind of death's pet, right? After hearing Odin's words, Sherlock nodded hurriedly. After all, judging by Odin's reaction, it seemed like his supposed predicament could still be salvaged. Seeing Sherlock's panic, Odin's smile widened, and he addressed her. Don't worry, these are just rumors. This little creature is actually just a devourer. It would have been better if Odin hadn't said anything. After he finished speaking, Sherlock and Thor refuted Odin's words almost in unison. Impossible. I checked, impossible. I know devourers. Sherlock, who claimed to have checked, and Thor, who claimed to have known, were both equally astonished. After all, this situation was like adopting a fat, stray orange dog in the real world, only to discover that it was actually a devourer. Odin remained unperturbed by their objections. As if sensing his own impending end and wanting to be more tolerant of the children, his smile grew even more benevolent as he explained. Of course you can't recognize this as a devourer, because this type of devourer is the product of artificial breeding. Sherlock and Thor considered countless possibilities, but nothing could have occurred to them like this. Odin, unfazed by such cosmic revelations, recounted them like a storyteller child. The story was simple. Just like the world wars on Earth, a massive conflict had erupted between the universe and the universe. Since this was war, a creature like the Devourer, capable of devouring nearly everything, naturally caught the attention of those warmongering types. With a little modification, it would be a deadly weapon deployed on the battlefield. A weapon no one could resist. So, a group of frenzied scientists captured a number of devourers and began experimenting. Unfortunately, their plan was brilliant, but the results were far from perfect. Until the end of the war, this weapon-level element devourer war machine had never been successfully tested. Furthermore, after the war ended, the group simply abandoned the element devourer research facility, leaving the pitiful element devourers to fend for themselves. Perhaps due to early experiments or other reasons, the group abandoned the laboratory, but inadvertently gave rise to two element devourer variants among the test subjects. This mutated element devourer was not particularly interested in food, preferring souls over food. Indeed, this mutated element devourer's favorite food was souls. They lacked the terrifying tentacles of other element devourers, but unexpectedly gained the ability to devour souls, had two tails, and even their attacks were focused on souls. Compared to ordinary element devourers, this mutated element devourer was far rarer, and their exceptional cosmic survival abilities made them virtually unheard of throughout the universe. Frequently appearing near massacres and natural disasters to find food, they gradually became known as the pets of the god of death and the harvesters of souls. Only the leaders of the warring factions at the time knew of this. After all, weapons development and equipment take time and money, and Odin was actually one of the original investors. Of course, Odin would never tell Sherlock and Thor about this. No one could have imagined that this unintentional act would lead to the infamous reputation of the little creature atop Sherlock's head. Fate is truly strange. As for why the little creature was so drawn to Sherlock, it was simple: the sudden emergence of a death representing power within him. To this mutated devourer, this power was like catnip to Professor McGonagall, an addiction that would sink them deeper and deeper, a habit they could never truly quit. Thor and Sherlock were stunned by Odin's story. Neither could have imagined the little creature's life story could be so dramatic. War truly twists everything. It's truly unbelievable that these heartless bastards would target the adorable devourer. As a cat lover, Sherlock condemned this. As Odin's story came to a close, a look of fatigue could not be concealed on his face. He waved to Thor and said, "Thor, take your friend and leave. Treat your friend well. You've troubled your friend more than once." Following Odin's words, Sherlock and Thor bowed slightly before leaving the room in unison. Sherlock immediately held little Coldball in his arms. Seeing the clear, foolish look in his little Coldball's eyes, Sherlock couldn't help himself. Amidst the little Coldball's meows, he buried his face in its belly and took a deep breath. That's right, this time it's the taste of the devourer. Sherlock, too, has experienced the existence of a devourer. But neither Sherlock, Thor, nor even Odin knew that this mutated devourer was actually born from rebirth after death. The soul isn't just food for this little creature, it's also its toy. In other words, this little guy is truly inextricably linked to death. After all, no one knows whether death is a cat lover, and who can really refuse a cute little kitty? Chapter 319, The characteristic of Asgard is the bathhouse? Perhaps feeling guilty about having forced Sherlock to use the Rainbow Bridge several times, or perhaps because Thor's father had spoken, Thor didn't immediately pull Sherlock aside to tell him about his situation. Instead, he mysteriously led Sherlock away from Odin's palace. Once they were truly gone, Thor looked at Sherlock with a lewd expression and said, "My father is right. You've worked so hard all this time. Come, I'll show you the uniqueness of Asgard." Seeing Thor's lewd expression, Sherlock truly doubted the legitimacy of Thor's so-called uniqueness. However, Sherlock didn't say anything. After all, he was curious about Thor's so-called uniqueness. Sherlock had been to Asgard more than once, but aside from the few times Thor had spoken to Sherlock at the Rainbow Bridge Gate, Sherlock had only actually set foot in Asgard once. It was the time when the Ancient One brought Sherlock to demand justice, but Sherlock hadn't really claimed to be going to Asgard to learn about it. For the first half of their trip, Sherlock had been holed up in the library, studying furiously. After finally leaving the library, Sherlock resumed his routine of going back to his room, the cafeteria, and the training grounds. It was only at the end that Sherlock went to the Asgardian market to buy some souvenirs. It wasn't much of an understanding of Asgard. After all, one can't claim to understand a place simply by shopping there once, right? Sherlock was genuinely interested in the specialties of Asgard that Thor had mentioned. After Thor led Sherlock out of the palace gates, he led her through alleyways. The further they went, the more something seemed off. After all, why would a normal place need to be located in such a secluded place? Sherlock began to plan in his head how he would later refuse and act so righteously, then be forced by Thor to rescue the young ladies because he couldn't defeat him. But what Sherlock never expected was that after a while of twists and turns, Thor brought Sherlock to a fucking bathhouse. Yes, one of those bathhouses you see everywhere in the north. But honestly, Sherlock was even more excited to see the bathhouse than the young ladies. You have to know that in the so-called privacy-conscious environment of the Eagle Sauce family, Sherlock had never seen the human skin polishing engineers he used to see before his time travel. Well, that's what they call bathroom scrubbers. Sherlock had never seen a fucking bathhouse scrubber, let alone a fucking bathhouse scrubber. God knows how uncomfortable Sherlock felt when he first traveled through time. Honestly, it was because Sherlock could still take a bath at home. He gradually got used to it and stopped thinking about it. Otherwise, Sherlock would be terribly uncomfortable. Now Sherlock couldn't believe Thor's furtive approach, as if he'd committed a crime. Leading him through the streets and alleys could only be a bathhouse. Looking at the strangely familiar bathhouse entrance, Sherlock, speechless as he stared at Thor's excited face, asked his soul-searching question. "Say, dear Mr. Thor, I see you're being so furtive, like you're hiding from the public. You brought me to the bathhouse? You were so furtive just now." After Sherlock finished speaking, Thor looked at Sherlock, his eyes widening as he stared at him intently, his face bewildered. "You actually know about a bathhouse?" "No, how did you know?" "I've never seen a bathhouse in Midgard." "How did you know?" Sherlock rolled his eyes at Thor's shrewd, seemingly ignorant look. Don't worry about it. I'm just asking, do you really need to be so sneaky about taking a bath? Seeing Sherlock's expression, Thor rolled his eyes in annoyance before speaking. Isn't this just to add a sense of ritual and mystery to you? How could I have known you knew all about this Asgard speciality? How about I take you somewhere else? After hearing Thor's words, Sherlock's eyes nearly bulged out in a wave of his hand. All he could say was, "Husky among dogs, Thor among men." That statement was absolutely true. However, upon hearing Thor's suggestion to change places, Sherlock refused without hesitation. Just kidding. Today, Sherlock wants to soak to his heart's content. Even the Celestials won't be any use, I say. Under Thor's stunned gaze, Sherlock skillfully took his cards, changed his shoes, changed his clothes, and whistled as he made his way to the bathing area. Sherlock had initially thought a little briquette on his head might be a bit repulsive to water. After all, even though it looked like a cute kitten, kittens don't like water. But to Sherlock's surprise, the little briquette was even more excited than Sherlock, patting Sherlock with its soft pink paws the entire way, seemingly eager to take a bath. Sherlock naturally ignored Thor, who was standing in the cabinet, whispering soothing words to Meowth, and excitedly rushed to the bathing area with his handcards and towel. When Sherlock finally arrived at the bathing area, he was stunned by what he saw. Although both were bathhouses, the Asgardian bathhouse was clearly different from the bathhouses Sherlock had traveled to in the north. The most obvious difference was that the environment and layout of this bathhouse resembled a combination of ancient Roman baths and Turkish baths. For some reason, the bathhouse wasn't crowded. The steam filled the air, and even someone from the south who'd never been to a bathhouse before could soak in it with ease. Sherlock was still in shock, but it was clear that the little coal ball on Sherlock's head couldn't wait any longer. It jumped off Sherlock's head and quickly ran to a pool, testing the water temperature with its paws. Once it felt the water was right, it used its front two paws to grab the edge of the pool and carefully lowered itself into the water. Well, given its height, even if it stood up, it certainly wouldn't be able to reach the ground, but that didn't stop it from enjoying its bath. Before Sherlock could recover, the little coal ball was already floating comfortably in the pool, belly up, and meowing a meow of comfort. Chapter 320 Thor, you're finally in my hands. It wasn't until the small coal balls began to purr comfortably in the pool that Sherlock was finally awakened by Thor, who had arrived late. Looking at the bathhouse before him, Sherlock was overwhelmed with emotion. The towering Roman columns, the golden lion heads that constantly spurted hot water, the clear, steaming pool, the fiery marble Turkish Kang, and the busy masser. Everything confirmed one thing: this was Sherlock's dream bathhouse. Barely any doubt. Sherlock followed Thor into the pool where the small coal balls were already soaking. And you know what? Thor's muscles were quite nice. He had no idea if they would attract the opposite sex, but he definitely did. Excessive exercise is a bad idea. It was only because Thor was born in Europe or America. Otherwise, with his bodybuilding competition-worthy build, he'd probably never find love. Of course, gays are another matter. When Sherlock finally sat in the hot water, he felt like he was coming back to life. It's been ages since he'd showered, and this little treat was definitely refreshing. Ignoring Thor's hesitation, Sherlock grabbed a purple clay teapot from the library, along with some poor tea he'd bought on his last trip. He used magic to heat up the water and calmly began brewing tea by the edge of the pool. Bathing and drinking tea was Sherlock's absolute favorite pastime during his vacations before the time travel. It was only after the time travel that he hadn't had the luxury of doing so. Otherwise, Sherlock wouldn't have given up this hobby. But since Thor was treating her this time, and seeing him watching him curiously as he made tea, Sherlock didn't hesitate. He also took a cup from his library and poured it out for Thor. Out of curiosity, Thor took Sherlock's cup and took a sip of the pour he'd brewed. He immediately launched into a critique of the tea, hurling comments like bitter tree leaves and unpalatable. Sherlock was furious, and he cursed Thor, saying he couldn't stomach fine bran. He turned and produced a floating tray, loaded it with a side dish and a bottle of rubbing alcohol, along with a teacup Thor had been using, and pushed it toward Thor. This time, Thor finally found his taste. He leaned back comfortably in the pool, occasionally enjoying a sip of his wine and a bite of his side dish. He sighed, Sherlock, this outsider, actually knows how to enjoy life more than he, a local. Seeing Thor's seemingly indifferent demeanor, Sherlock rolled his eyes, internally complaining. This is how you enjoy life? If you were to go to a bathhouse in northeast China, Wouldn't you be in heaven? Although Sherlock didn't say anything, he still gave the old-fashioned man a look of disdain before speaking. Come on, stop talking nonsense and tell me what you want. Let's make it clear, even if you treat me to a bath, I won't help you if I can't do it. After hearing Sherlock's words, Thor suddenly realized that he hadn't just brought Sherlock here for a treat, he also needed help with something. He quickly put on a flattering smile and began to tell Sherlock what had happened. The story was actually quite simple. Hadn't Thor asked Sherlock to deliver a letter to Jane last time? But Thor had also specifically asked Heimdall to keep an eye on the letter, hoping to learn Jane's address. As it turned out, Heimdall was quite reliable and actually let Thor know Jane's address. And so, the two, who were in a long-distance relationship, began to send letters to each other using the Rainbow Bridge. Yes, you heard right. They were using the Rainbow Bridge to send messages. Sherlock was stunned when he heard this. Asgard's main gun was being used by this love-minded golden retriever to send love letters. Sherlock silently felt sorry for the Rainbow Bridge. Everything was fine, but for some reason, Jane had recently started ignoring Thor. Thor even sent her several letters but received no reply. Then Jane simply disappeared. Yes, she disappeared. Not even Heimdall could find her. After all, Heimdall wasn't omnipotent. He was just helping Thor keep an eye on Jane. Heimdall was supposed to be watching the Nine Realms. But even if Heimdall were watching, it wouldn't work. She wasn't the letter Thor had sent. To truly escape Heimdall's gaze was simple, just hide in the subway. Even if Heimdall were powerful, he couldn't predict when or where you'd leave the station, could he? Sherlock rolled his eyes when he heard this. Now Thor wasn't just a love-brained idiot, he'd become a straight-laced, love-brained idiot. Why else would he ignore you? First, you left without saying goodbye, and then, when communication finally worked, you used the Rainbow Bridge to unilaterally communicate. If it were Sherlock, he would have ignored you long ago. To put it simply, it was just a quarrel between a couple. Thor's idea was simple too. He wanted Sherlock to see if he could find Jane and put in a good word for him, explaining the situation to her so she would pay attention. Sherlock was speechless at Thor's request. For some reason, Sherlock felt like he was part of some weird game between Jane and Thor. Shaking his head vigorously, Sherlock quickly cleared the yellow garbage from his mind. Looking across at Thor, he thought about the several cars he had scrapped because of him. Then he thought about the last time when he helped deliver a love letter to this guy, and because of his love for the car, he was pressed to the ground twice in front of Heimdall and suffered humiliation. At this moment, Sherlock finally had a ferocious smile on his face. Good fellow, Thor, you bastard finally fell into my hands. Today, if I don't blackmail you until there's nothing left of you, then you will be stripped clean today. Sherlock, who was possessed by Sujang, decisively put the teacup in his hand on the edge of the pool, and immediately sat down in the pool with a majestic look. He looked at Thor beside him with an embarrassed expression, and said in a very arrogant tone, "Ahem, little Thor, this matter is not impossible in principle." Chapter 321 Return Home. Asgardians are known for their brawn. Sherlock's little trick of yes in principle, but not in practice, no in principle, but yes in practice left Thor bewildered. After all, before crossing over, Sherlock had gone to Shandong to study for a level 8 essay, aiming to pass the civil service exam and fulfill his ambition to serve his country. He might have failed, but his foundation was there. Thor might be a member of the Asgardian royal family and the first heir, but when it comes to makeup, even his father wouldn't be able to withstand Sherlock's deception. In the end, both Sherlock and Thor were very satisfied with the outcome. Thor saw it as a mere expensive useless money, and Sherlock was able to help him with his lifelong affairs. Sherlock, on the other hand, saw a significant benefit, at least he wouldn't have to worry about bathing anymore. Indeed, Sherlock's condition was to provide him with all the necessary materials for a bathhouse of the same design. Thor didn't hesitate, and the two happily reached a consensus on a partnership. After a pleasant soak for a while, after sharing some cosmic gossip, Sherlock and Thor went to the human skin polishing master to polish themselves. After completing all the procedures, Sherlock walked out of the bathhouse with ease. Thor took him back to the palace along the main road, arranged a room for Sherlock and told him to wait for the night. He would get the materials Sherlock needed the next day. Sherlock, feeling weak all over from the bath, naturally did not refuse. After all, there was nothing more comfortable than a good night's sleep after a bath full of fatigue. After watching Thor leave, Sherlock looked at his knees that were almost glistening, and felt a long-lost refreshment. He happily took out a bottle of ice milk from the library, drank it, and then lay down on the bed to prepare for sleep. If there was one thing he was dissatisfied with about this bathhouse trip, it was that this bathhouse didn't even offer cupping or foot massage services. But it was understandable. If the bathhouse in Asgard also offered services like cupping and foot massage like the one on the rabbit side, then Sherlock would really doubt the existence of the mysterious Eastern power. Early the next morning, Thor brought Sherlock to an open space in front of the palace gate. As the Prince of Asgard, Thor had access to a vast amount of resources. It was not difficult for him to get the decoration materials for a bathhouse in one night. Sherlock didn't hesitate. With a wave of his hand, the decoration materials that almost filled the entire open space disappeared without a trace in an instant. It was shrunk by who knows how many times before appearing in Sherlock's library. Seeing Sherlock's move, Thor felt terrible. He even looked at Sherlock standing beside him with some resentment. "Wow, you mages are so convenient. I spent all night moving these things." Hearing Thor's complaints, Sherlock let out a sneer of laughter. Out of respect for their deal, Thor could only grit his teeth at Sherlock's mad mockery. After all, he'd already paid the balance, but Sherlock hadn't done anything yet. Transformed into boiling sheep, Thor eagerly awaited Sherlock's help in resolving the issue of his beautiful sheep Jane's wrath. Naturally, he wouldn't pin Sherlock to the ground like he had before. Thor was improving, but this progress had nothing to do with Sherlock. As a good brother, Sherlock would definitely laugh the loudest of them all, but when it came to helping, he genuinely did. As for Thor's progress, well, at most, he'd evolved from a husky to golden retriever. It was clear that Odin still had a long way to go in his education. After all this time, Thor still hadn't quite grown out of his dog status. With a wild grin and a quick greeting to Thor, Sherlock, clutching his little bear cat, stepped onto the rainbow bridge with unbridled arrogance, heading towards the main entrance. Thor, left behind, glared at Sherlock with gritted teeth. Their expressions seemed to say everything, yet it also seemed as if nothing had been said. The two brothers understood each other's meaning. "Sherlock, you still need my help? Are you still so arrogant? Come on, try to pressure me like last time." "Thor, I'm not angry, I'm not angry. I chose my good buddy, I chose my good buddy. This is a disobedient son, this is a disobedient son." Sherlock had inadvertently given Thor a taste of what Odin was like looking at him. Fate, it must be said, was a strange thing. With a rainbow bridge crashing from the sky, Sherlock returned to his familiar training grounds. It had to be said that, after this trip to Asgard, Sherlock had finally returned without a grudge. Sherlock even considered this trip's gains second only to the time the Ancient One took him to Asgard. Upon returning, Sherlock didn't go straight to Jane Urshi, but instead returned to his own home. After all, nuggets of gold and silver couldn't compare to his own humble abode. While the Asgardian palace was indeed comfortable and luxurious, Sherlock simply felt it couldn't compare to the comforts of his own home. He decided to rest up first. After all, technically, this was still an interstellar journey. Of course, he didn't forget to arrange his own Asgardian-style bathroom. Upon returning home, Sherlock used his authority to summon Tony's steel construction team, generously handed all the materials to the armored men, and then hurried back to his own house. Pulling out his wand in his bathroom, Sherlock began to frantically cast the so-called invisible expansion charm, not forgetting to permanently secure his expanded bathroom. After sorting out the side issues, Sherlock took a quick shower before calling the steel construction team to begin work. Watching the fleet of armored men carrying materials in and out of his house, Sherlock could even imagine the wonderful life ahead. Of course, Sherlock's ostentatious actions couldn't be hidden from the others at the training ground. But surprisingly, no one, from Tony to the two girls, asked Sherlock what he was up to. Unbeknownst to Sherlock, ever since he began renovating his luxurious bathroom, the group at the training ground had been circulating Sherlock's house key. As the saying goes, if my neighbor stores food, I store guns. My neighbor is my granary. Facing these American-educated idiots, Sherlock was still too inexperienced. Chapter 322 Jane and Sherlock. Sherlock's bathroom was being renovated, and naturally, Sherlock couldn't stay home. After all, even if he could tolerate the clanking noise, he couldn't stand the pervasive dust. After handing the blueprints Thor had brought to Jarvis, who was controlling the Iron Man suit, Sherlock said goodbye to Tony and the others, then left his house full of anticipation, still imagining the luxurious bathroom he'd have all to himself upon his return. Finding a quiet spot, Sherlock calmly pulled out his phone and called Jane. The call connected quickly. Jane on the other end wasn't the grouchy girlfriend Sherlock had imagined, harder to deal with than a pig during Chinese New Year. Instead, she chatted with Sherlock in a relaxed tone, chatting about everyday life for a while. Neither of them mentioned Thor's silly golden retriever. After a while, Sherlock finally inquired about Jane's current location, and the answer shocked Sherlock. Jane was still in Europe. And not only in Europe, but she had become a special consultant for SHIELD. After hearing what Jane said, Sherlock was completely dumbfounded. SHIELD? Did he disband that thing? Even SHIELD's two senior agents, Black Widow and Hawkeye, were now at his home. Not only were they at home, but they were also living an extremely comfortable life. Black Widow swam and exercised all day, and worked as a teacher. Her life was comfortable and carefree. Hawkeye, on the other hand, turned into a super dad and kept nursing his child. He even used all his archery skills to nurse his child. God knows how shocked Sherlock was when he saw Hawkeye make a bottle arrow and actually use it. How could there be such a thing as SHIELD? Facing Sherlock's question, Jane did not hide anything and explained it to Sherlock openly. Through Jane's explanation, Sherlock finally understood what this so-called SHIELD was. That's right, it's the Marvel spin-off TV series, the SHIELD from Agents of SHIELD. The unfortunate Coulson was ultimately tricked by the even more sinister Black Egg, becoming the so-called director of SHIELD. However, compared to the SHIELD during Black Egg's time, the current SHIELD is much less powerful than it once was. It primarily assists the government in handling mysterious matters and superpowered individuals, but lacks the official affiliation of the past. Simply put, SHIELD is like those so-called exorcists you've seen. The government pays them to solve seemingly paranormal, mysterious, and superpowered matters. The entire organization has been transformed from a government-run organization to a private one, but compared to other private organizations, the so-called SHIELD, under Coulson, boasts superior logistics and technical expertise. Consequently, there's no shortage of orders, especially in Europe. After all, with the Avengers on the Eagle side and the mysterious Eastern powers backing them, SHIELD's only market was limited to businesses in Europe and Africa. Sherlock was deeply moved by this. After all, when he was watching the TV series, Agents of SHIELD was one of his favorites. Although Sherlock had abandoned the series after the plot fell apart and its connection to the Marvel Universe became less relevant, no one could deny how captivating the early season was. Furthermore, in Sherlock's opinion, Coulson was arguably the most ruthless person he had ever treacherous. After briefly inquiring about Jane's current location and whether anyone else was with her, and after receiving her address and Jane's negative response, Sherlock opened the portal without hesitation. Jane held the phone, watching the sparks in front of her slowly swirl, forming a ring of fire the size of a person. Sherlock, on the other side, held the phone and greeted her, his expression completely transfixed. Sherlock understood perfectly the shock a muggle felt after witnessing magic for the first time. Without explaining anything to Jane, he hung up the phone and walked through the portal on his own. Jane stared at him in astonishment until the portal closed behind her. If it weren't for the busy tone on the phone, she would have thought she was dreaming. Without a second thought, he pinched his thigh hard. The sharp pain told her she wasn't dreaming, but even then, she didn't react. How had her friend suddenly become a superpowered person? Jane felt her CPU was about to smoke, but she couldn't understand. We'd all agreed to be normal people, and now you'd secretly evolved, and you'd even left me alone? Jane's CPU was still overclocking, her mind filled with thoughts of her boyfriend, Thor, and Sherlock, now a superpowered person. Meanwhile, Sherlock was curiously surveying his surroundings. This wasn't some old European apartment building, as Sherlock had imagined, but a base that looked incredibly high-tech. If nothing unexpected happened, this was one of the bases of SHIELD. After taking in his surroundings, Sherlock seemed to remember something and raised his hand to greet Jane. Hi. At Sherlock's greeting, Jane's frantic CPU seemed to finally react. She quickly walked over and pulled Sherlock around, looking him around. No, Sherlock, you? Jane stumbled, momentarily unsure how to express her shock. Seeing Jane's expression, As if to say, "Why did you evolve secretly without me?" Sherlock finally sighed helplessly. With a flick of his wrist, Sherlock's wand appeared in his right hand. He waved it before Jane's eyes, and a look of understanding dawned on her. After all, during the Battle of New York, Sherlock's wand had almost become the iconic weapon of his alias, the Wizard. It had become one of the best-selling toys in the United States, along with Meowth's hammer, Iron Man's mask, and the Hulk's fist glove. Jane naturally recognized a wand in Sherlock's hand, but even though she knew it, Jane's expression was still complicated. What kind of luck did she have? Her boyfriend was an Avenger, the Asgardian god of thunder. She had thought this was already shocking enough, but now she was told that one of her good friends was actually the most mysterious and powerful Avenger, the Wizard, in the Battle of New York. Jane felt that if she told others about her experience, no one would believe her and would think she was joking. Just as Jane was about to say something, a gentle male voice sounded beside Sherlock and Jane. "Long time no see, Mr. Sherlock, or should I call you Mr. Wizard?" Chapter 323 Sherlock's Exposure in Progress. Sherlock, who was showing off his wand to Jane, froze in place as if under a spell when he heard the familiar male voice. Even the smile on his face froze. Sherlock's CPU was spinning at full speed, oblivious to any physical movement. As for the voice, Sherlock instantly recognized it, the good old Marvel man, Coulson. While he was often called a good guy, that was only true compared to the bad guys. Among other people, he was a wicked villain. Sherlock remained frozen in place, frantically pondering. Coulson, however, ignored Sherlock's rather rude behavior and quickly approached Jane, leaning down to whisper something in her ear. Jane then glanced at Coulson with a complicated expression, then back at Sherlock, who was still performing the spell. Her brows furrowed, and after a moment's thought, she nodded to Coulson before quickly departing. After watching Jane leave, Coulson stood in Jane's place, unburdened, and chuckled as Sherlock continued to perform his immobilization spell. After a while, Sherlock finally gave in. With a slightly evasive look, he looked at Coulson, who still stood before him with a smile on his face. "Ha ha ha, Coulson, I'm going to tell you I'm performing a magic trick for Jane. Do you believe me?" After hearing Sherlock's words, Coulson raised an amused brow and slightly extended a hand towards Sherlock, clearly signaling, "Begin your show." Sherlock's smile faltered, and he steeled himself by shaking his wand and quickly tossing it into the library. Then, like a stage magician, he dramatically opened his arms. "Da-da!" Sherlock even dubbed himself, explaining how he had instantly made such a large wand disappear. Turning around, he saw Skye, his old acquaintance, looking at him with a complicated expression. Well, at this moment Sherlock felt that he had lost all his faith in this life today. That bastard Thor, every time he saw him, something bad was going to happen. Sherlock smiled on the surface, but in his heart he was like a doll with rusty joints. He silently moved his eyes away from Skye and turned to Coulson, who was smiling. The three of them stood together calmly without saying a word. Sherlock felt that he was about to dig out the entire Hogwarts castle with his toes. After a while, Sherlock was finally defeated. He sighed helplessly and returned to his usual appearance. "Okay, you win, Coulson. I am indeed a wizard." After saying that, Sherlock felt a lot more relaxed. Coulson stood there smiling as if he had expected it, but Skye was shocked. After all, Skye had spent far longer with Sherlock than Coulson. It was hard to imagine that the wizard who had soared in the Battle of New York, the powerful wizard who could erect a 100-meter wall of fire with a wave of his wand, was actually their incredibly unreliable boss. Indeed, in Skye's mind, Sherlock was primarily characterized by unreliability. After all, compared to Sherlock's 5 uncles, Sherlock, a man of fun who could occasionally become a source of fun, naturally seemed a bit unreliable. Skye truly struggled to connect Sherlock's disguise with Sherlock himself. Coulson, on the other hand, was much calmer. Not only was Sherlock's exposure accidental, but his years of experience had honed his composure, even in the face of a catastrophic event. As for Sherlock, once he relaxed, he began to behave normally. After all, he and Coulson got along quite well. Sherlock smiled and gave Coulson a long-awaited hug. Coulson embraced. But Sherlock's way of greeting him was unnecessary and he didn't like it at all. "Long time no see, Coulson. Last time I saw you, you were covered in mushrooms," Sherlock said, patting Coulson's back vigorously. Unnoticed by Sherlock, Coulson's well-kept smile faltered. Amidst Skye's shocked and stifled laughter, Callison muttered as sarcasm. "It's all thanks to you, Sherlock." Just as the two were about to separate and Callison was about to say something to Sherlock, Sherlock seemed to have guessed what Callison was going to do. He turned around, smiling, and walked towards Skye with open arms, as if he wanted to hug his long-unseen employee. Sherlock's abrupt turn was so abrupt that even Skye, not only Callison, noticed it, and quickly placed her hand on Sherlock's chest, a look of resignation. Just as Sherlock was about to throw a tantrum, telling Skye, "You don't love me anymore, you're no longer the little cashier who once loved me," Callison grabbed Sherlock by the scruff of the neck. "Come on, Sherlock, let's get down to business." After hearing Callison's words, Sherlock put aside his playful thoughts. After all, his cover was exposed. He turned to Callison, waiting for his next words. Callison didn't hold out much hope, but he still wanted to give it a try, so he began explaining the current state of SHIELD to Sherlock. The gist of it was that SHIELD was increasingly involved in the supernatural and mystical, and they wanted to hire Sherlock as a consultant. After all, Sherlock was the only known magician and expert in the occult. Sherlock refused Callison's request without hesitation. Most importantly, Black Egg was a complete jerk. He'd faked his own death and escaped, and it was unclear whether he was now in space, as depicted in the TV series, or living a leisurely life in some secret base. But the shield he left behind for Callison still had many holes. Hydra definitely didn't exist only in the SHIELD headquarters building. God knows where in the world there are remnants of Hydra plotting to take over SHIELD's legacy. Sherlock has no interest in these troubles. Of course, Sherlock is not a devil. Although he can't help Callison, Sherlock still recommends someone who can help him to Callison, Captain. Captain is now searching the world for Hydra's base, wanting to defeat Hydra and rescue his good friend. Callison can definitely ask Captain for help. Since Callison is Captain's die-hard fan, Sherlock believes that Captain will definitely not refuse Callison's request. Moreover, Captain should also need Callison's intelligence. This is a win-win situation. Chapter 324 Jane's Quantum Superposition Boyfriend. Although he'd known Sherlock's chances of consulting with him were slim, the news that Captain America was still fighting on the front lines against Hydra was enough to cheer Callison up. After finishing his business, Callison and Sherlock engaged in small talk, showing Jane around the SHIELD base. The main point of Callison's inquiry was Sherlock's reason for visiting Jane. Of course, as a senior SHIELD agent and now director, Callison was known for his indirect, unspoken questions. Driven by curiosity and the desire to explore the Holy Land, Sherlock naturally had no reason to refuse Callison's invitation. And surprisingly, Sherlock saw quite a bit, most notably the massive plane that served as the base and agents of SHIELD. It wasn't visible in the TV series, but in person, it was incredibly large. Sherlock had no idea how big the C-17 transport plane used by the mold, but he was certain Callison's plane was definitely bigger. The cabin was packed with everything, from the operations room to the lab, from the lounge area to the work area. Sherlock even spotted Callison's beloved car, which he considered his wife. He wondered if this was just a small perk Callison had used his power to curry for him. Sherlock even excitedly took a photo with the massive plane. But when Callison showed Sherlock around the base, he didn't quite match his excitement. His mind was filled with a single thought: damn, I didn't charge enough for Black Egg when I was selling potions. This base was located in a suburb of London. As a world-renowned city, the land price here was unimaginable. Even in the suburbs, the price was definitely out of reach for ordinary organizations. And most importantly, the base was underground. From construction to concealment, who knows how much Black Egg had spent. Crucially, Sherlock absolutely didn't believe that this was the only base Black Braised Egg had left for Callison. Putting aside the base he'd left for Callison, who knew how many more bases Black Braised Egg had hidden, yet he hadn't told anyone. It was conceivable how much money this shady-looking but even more shady-hearted wretch had embezzled from SHIELD compared to the small sum he'd spent on potions and the sum Black Braised Egg had embezzled from SHIELD. It probably wasn't even a fraction. The more Sherlock looked at it, the more he felt he'd been shortchanged. Of course, Callison didn't know Sherlock's thoughts. While showing Sherlock around, he began to bend over backwards to get Sherlock to understand why he'd come to Jane. Honestly, Sherlock didn't understand Callison at first. Sherlock, an 8th-level SA writer, simply couldn't grasp what Callison was saying. Finally, After Callison repeatedly pared down his evasiveness, Sherlock seemed to finally understand. After understanding Callison's words, Sherlock patted Callison's shoulder with a complicated expression and uttered something that left Callison scratching his head. "Callison, let me be clear. If you were taking the civil service exam on Rabbit Road, I'm sure you'd get it with flying colors. And you'd definitely be the top candidate for the position in the interview, a perfect score." Confused by Sherlock's teasing, Callison, who had never traveled through time, couldn't understand Sherlock's jokes. But Sherlock naturally didn't care and began to explain to Callison why he was there. What else could he be here for? Of course, it was for Jane's boyfriend, who was currently in a quantum superposition state. He had been sent here by Jane's quantum superposition boyfriend to persuade Jane to remove the words quantum superposition state. Callison was completely bewildered by Sherlock's repeated quantum superposition state remarks. Callison knew the term quantum superposition. It was a technical term from quantum mechanics, but he truly didn't understand the term quantum superposition boyfriend. "Are young people these days so profound?" was Callison's only thought after hearing Sherlock's explanation. He turned to Skye, also a young woman, hoping to understand what Sherlock was talking about. Skye rolled her eyes at Callison's plea for help and whispered in his ear. The so-called quantum superposition boyfriend was actually quite simple. It was somewhere between a boyfriend and an ex-boyfriend, depending on Jane's decision. As long as Jane made a decision, the quantum superposition boyfriend would collapse, becoming either a boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend. After Skye's explanation, Callison finally understood Sherlock's intentions. He was, in effect, trying to persuade Jane to reconcile with her boyfriend and not break up. After figuring out Sherlock's exact purpose, Callison couldn't help but stare at him with a look of grievance. "Just now, you declined an invitation to deal with the mysterious and superpowered beings threatening ordinary people, yet you'd happily come when someone asked you to be their strategist and advise their girlfriend. So, our careers aren't even as important to you as love?" Faced with Callison's aggrieved look, Sherlock could only evade. After all, Sherlock truly disliked being associated with SHIELD and Hydra. The SHIELD situation had already given Sherlock a bit of a PTSD. Hydra and SHIELD were like sticky plasters to Sherlock. Once they got stuck, they couldn't be shaken off, making it incredibly troublesome. Forced to change the subject, Sherlock began asking about Jane's whereabouts. After all, Sherlock had just watched Callison whisper something into Jane's ear, and then Jane left. In response to Sherlock's questioning, Callison, despite his resentment, didn't hide Jane's whereabouts and began explaining to Sherlock. "John Bull's government report says something strange is happening at a factory in London. We need to investigate. A preliminary survey revealed that space there appears to be a warped and folded structure. Jane, our physics consultant, has gone to investigate." It would have been fine if Callison hadn't said anything, but after he finished, Sherlock erupted in a sharp, furious outburst. "Damn, this plot is damn familiar. Isn't this the beginning of Thor 2? If Sherlock remembered correctly, the plot began with a reality stone entering Jane's body, leading to the subsequent events. And that was the reality stone, a being capable of directly altering and distorting reality. To Sherlock, it was like a phone booth from the Marvel Universe. Naturally, Sherlock wanted to see it. Of course, the most important thing was to keep Jane away from the reality stone. After all, Thor had asked him to come and apologize to Jane, and now that he was here, Jane was sent to the hospital. That would be outrageous, wouldn't it? Without hesitation, Sherlock grabbed Callison's shoulder with a serious face and began to ask for the location. Seeing Sherlock's presumptuous look, Callison rolled his eyes, a smile appeared on his face. And without hesitation, he revealed Jane's address. Chapter 325, The Dangerous Factory. After obtaining Jane's address, Sherlock unleashed his wand without hesitation, intending to create a portal to stop her. Unfortunately, the sparks of the portal shone for a long time, but ultimately no portal appeared. Either the sparks were the wrong color, or the usual round portals were polygonal in shape. Even the scene beyond the portal was completely different from anything Sherlock had ever seen. It felt like an old TV with a bad signal. According to the plot, Jane should have been in an abandoned factory. The scene beyond Sherlock's portal bore no resemblance to a factory. Several areas even looked unearthly. After all, Sherlock had never seen pink earth or blue plants in his entire lifetime. Sherlock naturally didn't dare step through such an unusual portal. After all, no one knew what lay beyond it, and whether he could ever get out. Finally, with no other options, Sherlock pulled out his phone, opened a map, and began experimenting, trying to determine the distance needed to create a stable portal. 10 minutes later, Sherlock confirmed that, a kilometer from the factory where the incident occurred, spatial stability remained unaffected by the reality stone. After confirming that the scenery on the other side of the portal was normal and the portal itself was unaffected, Sherlock exchanged a greeting with Coulson, who had been standing behind him, watching him perform his magic, and stepped through. Once through, Sherlock, without hesitation, swung his long legs and followed a navigation system, sprinting towards the factory ahead. What? Why didn't Sherlock open the portal a little wider and borrow Coulson's car? Why did he have to travel on foot? It was true. Let him go. Coulson wasn't the same wretch he'd been. SHIELD was broke, and there were still remnants of Hydra lurking in the shadows, watching covetously. From Coulson's introduction and Jane's phone call, Sherlock knew that SHIELD was currently using government funds to subsidize its fight against Hydra. Otherwise, Coulson wouldn't have been so excited about his or Captain America's joining. After all, the addition of an Avenger would save a lot of combat power, and saved combat power meant saved ammunition and weapons. Weapons, ammunition, and personnel, which one wasn't built with real money? As for why Sherlock didn't put a convenient two-wheeled vehicle in the library, Sherlock would never admit that he had never learned how to ride two wheels in his entire life. It's just that he doesn't like it, not that he can't. In fact, Sherlock was practically envious when he saw those Harley-Davidson cruisers. Especially in the land of the Eagle Sauce, where gangster culture reigns supreme, Sherlock would shed tears of envy every time he saw a fleet of cruisers wearing leather vests. After about 5 minutes of frantic running, Sherlock stopped breathlessly at the factory gate. He gasped, his eyes terrified as he watched the men in black suits walking around with instruments inside. While this scene might not seem unusual to ordinary people, to Sherlock, these men in black suits holding instruments were practically dancing on a tightrope. Space is the world's sharpest blade and the strongest shield. Nothing can escape its slicing, and any attack can be folded through space, constantly consuming energy, ultimately rendering the attack ineffective. Space is a shield, a cage, a trap, a sharp knife, each one of them enough to pose a deadly threat. Sherlock saw the factory as a dangerous place riddled with spatial traps. With luck, the most he could hope for was to fall into an endless looping portal and experience the sensation of free fall. On the other hand, if he was unlucky, dismemberment, compression, and being transported to an unknown location in the universe, where he would die alone, were commonplace. Even worse, he might find himself in the vacuum of space. Even if he had the equipment and abilities to survive the vacuum, the ubiquitous cosmic rays would be enough to kill him hundreds of times. Watching the group of men in black suits moving in and out of such a dangerous environment, Sherlock could only sigh. Ignorance is bliss. A newborn calf is not afraid of a tiger. Our ancestors were right. Honestly, if possible, Sherlock didn't want to enter the factory at all. After all, Sherlock wasn't one of the ordinary people in the factory, unable to perceive space. He even found the folding of space quite amusing. But Sherlock had no choice. On the one hand, he had promised Thor that he would come and mediate their minor conflict with Jane. On the other hand, Jane and he had a good relationship and could be considered one of his close friends. Naturally, Sherlock couldn't stand by and watch her fall into danger. After a long hesitation, Sherlock finally took a few deep breaths, tried to compose himself, and with the determination to succeed or die, he stepped into this place full of danger. As Sherlock entered, the men in black suits in the factory stopped their work and stared blankly at Sherlock. It wasn't surprising that they were so surprised. After all, they couldn't see or sense the dangerous spatial traps everywhere. From their perspective, Sherlock looked like a 007 agent dodging infrared alarms. In a movie, with those infrared alarms and the tense soundtrack, Sherlock's movements would have looked thrilling and graceful. It was a perfect demonstration of Sherlock's physical flexibility and strong training. Unfortunately, none of this existed in reality. Furthermore, the black suits had no idea of the space, so from their perspective, Sherlock's movements resembled those of someone with an underdeveloped brain and cerebellum. After all, everyone walked through that door, and no one made hand gestures like 6, 7, or even bent or bowed. Honestly, if Coulson hadn't announced Sherlock's arrival, the agents would have probably started arresting him based on Sherlock's psychotic posture alone. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.